Paul de Chailloux was born on the French colonial island of Reunion in July 1831 to a French trader father and a local African mother. Eventually, his father relocated Paul to the other side of Africa, where he was educated by missionaries in Gabon. That was the extent of de Chailloux's education. But from that foundation of learning and from his time living on the delta of the Oyongu River, he developed a passionate interest in natural history and the people of the region, so much so that after he emigrated to the United States as an adult, he convinced the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia to sponsor him in a years-long expedition into the wilds of West Africa. One of the things Paul de Chailloux learned while living among the natives of Gabon and from his guides while exploring the Oyongu was that a species of human-like animals roamed the lowland jungles. Europeans had brought fragmentary bones of these animals back, but debate raged as to what they represented. De Chailloux knew that they were living creatures. He knew that they were powerfully built, covered in dark hair, and that the people of the region feared them. And he knew where and how to find them. It was his intention, the bastard son of an itinerant trader without any formal education to speak of and barely any resources to his name, to prove to the world the existence of what we now call the Western lowland gorilla. And Paul de Chailloux did just that. After 4 years in the jungles, he emerged with complete specimens of an animal many refused to believe existed. In doing so, he challenged common perceptions of man's place in the natural world. This untrained, uneducated French-American made a discovery that rewrote natural history books. Eventually, de Chailloux collected, identified, and described to science dozens of West African species, birds, amphibians, and mammals. He also established the existence of the pygmy people of West Africa. Paul de Chailloux was a citizen scientist, someone untrained with no formal scientific education, but who nonetheless follows their passion for knowledge and discovery and helps advance scientific understanding of our world and the universe, sometimes in small ways, but sometimes in big ways. Citizen scientists help the USGS record and measure earthquakes. They count bird populations on Christmas Day. They decode Civil War telegrams and count Antarctic seals on satellite imagery. They track weather phenomena around the world and compile an atlas of bee populations in Minnesota. Citizen scientists observe. They record. They are and have always been the backbone of science. And they are and have always been those who fill out the member roles of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. I'm Brian Brown. On this episode of our podcast, you'll meet citizen scientists. You'll hear about their work and come to appreciate their commitment to our cause, the cause of discovery, the cause of conservation. We seek nothing more than what Paul de Chailloux sought more than 160 years ago, to upend our understanding of natural history and our place within it. This is the official podcast of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. This is Apes Among Us.
Welcome to another episode of Apes Among Us. I'm Matt Pruitt, joined by my co-host Brandon Lentz. How you doing there tonight, Brandon?
I'm fantastic, Matt. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. I'm really excited for people to hear this episode. We've put a lot of work into collecting the insights and inputs of people in the organization and a few outside of this organization into the topic of citizen scientists. And I think a lot of our listeners who are themselves researchers of this particular topic will find a lot of these things insightful and relatable and useful.
I also hope that folks take a listen to this episode and be inspired to go out and collect data and observe. You don't necessarily need to have a PhD in biology to collect data and present it to science, which is exactly what the NAWAC does.
Citizen science is defined as the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public. Now, in a broader sense, very often that happens in collaboration or cooperation with professionals, whether that is academics or professional scientists, et cetera. But it's not just wood ape research wherein that occurs. Astronomy, for example, has been a field that has long been contributed to by amateurs, especially even into modern times.
Yeah, just as early as January of this year, NASA put out data for the Kepler telescope for citizen scientists to pour through because they just didn't have the time. And within the first few days of them releasing that to the public, citizen scientists actually discovered a brand new exoplanet that is 2.5 times larger than the Earth.
I don't buy it. I don't believe it. My friends on the Skeptic Forum say it can't be real. That's incredible. And that's, very inspiring for people like us. I mean, myself, I'm not an academic, but I'm very much interested in being a part of something and contributing to something that is such a huge discovery. There was a member of ours, Jordan Horstman, who gave a really inspiring talk at the first member retreat that I went to. And he made a really brilliant point, and he had said, despite whatever you might be involved with in your personal or professional life, discovering the wood ape is probably the most important thing you will ever be involved in. And that meant a lot to me because I think it's true. So I can only imagine how the people that took part in the discovery of that exoplanet might feel about that.
I've been involved with the NAWAC now for 5 years, and in those 5 years, the chase for the discovery of the wood ape has dramatically reshaped my life to the point now where I'm actually attending college because I was inspired by the people involved with the NAWAC and inspired by just wildlife biology in general. So being a citizen scientist has actually inspired me to try to become more of a scientist in an academic sense.
Well, I definitely commend you for taking that on. That's awesome. Good for you, for sure. It's interesting, too. A lot of the people that we kind of revere and admire related to this field were not themselves academics initially. Like Jane Goodall is a good example. She was working as a secretary when she initially went to Gombe in 1960 and began the observational field study of chimpanzees. And it was only later that she received her PhD, and it was actually issued to her by a university that did not require her to first have a bachelor's degree. So I suspect that we'll all get our honorary doctorates in wood apery one of these days. But, Dian Fossey is another great example of someone of that nature. She had a bachelor's degree, but it was in occupational therapy. And she was working as an occupational therapist when she began her observational field studies of gorillas. And interestingly, Louis Leakey had reached out to her about one particular criteria, an assertion, he said, that he made mandatory that people should have their appendixes removed before venturing into the remote territory of the mountain gorilla, just to avoid potential hazards. So Dian Fossey had her appendix removed. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Leakey told her that there's really no dire need for that. It's just my way of testing applicants' determination. So luckily, no one's asked me to remove any vital or non-vital organs with this organization yet.
There's still time, Matt. Give it time.
Fortunately for us, the NAWAC has no shortage of members that have very impressive academic backgrounds, and one of those is longtime NAWAC member and the executive producer of this podcast, Daryl Collier. So let's bring him on. How you doing there tonight, Daryl?
Gentlemen, it's good to be here with you.
Excellent. And I know the listeners have heard your voice in multiple episodes thus far, but as it pertains to this particular aspect of the pursuit, can you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and your academic background and pursuits?
Well, as you said, my background is in history. I have a bachelor's degree in that. I'm currently pursuing graduate studies at Sam Houston State University in history. And so that is, history is one of my great passions, one of my great loves. In fact, I spend a good deal of my spare time listening to lectures and just gobbling up everything I can that has to do with history. So I'm not all just about, wood apes and that sort of thing. Love history as much as anything else.
Do they let you wear the camo and the face paint in the history classes?
Well, I don't know that I would want to try that, but they probably wouldn't have a problem with it as long as I, was able to contribute.
Indeed. Well, I've learned a great deal from just discussions with you in camp there and on the phone. I think you have a pretty stellar grasp of a lot of not just American history, but world history in general. And so I'm sure that the history of citizen science itself is something that you might have looked into, especially with the efforts of this group hinging upon that so much.
Well, when we first discussed this, the first thing that popped in my mind, was, I was thinking in terms of history. It was a great American. In fact, he's actually my favorite president, and that's Thomas Jefferson. A lot of people don't really know that Jefferson, as well known for his contributions to science, and particularly paleontology, as he is to politics and government. John Kennedy was entertaining a group of Nobel laureates. And when he was in the room with them all gathered together, he remarked that this was probably the greatest gathering of intellect in the White House since Thomas Jefferson had dined there alone. So President Kennedy knew well about Jefferson's reputation, and Jefferson was known during his lifetime for being a man of science, and we don't think of that a lot of times because we have the Declaration of Independence, of which he was the primary author, but he was a fine mathematician. He was an astronomer. He was known as an expert in anatomy, civil engineering, physics, mechanics, meteorology, architecture, botany. Jefferson was conversant in Greek, Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian. He was recognized as a pioneer in geography, anthropology, and, like I said, paleontology. In fact, some people refer to him as the father of American paleontology.
Daryl, what do you think that Thomas Jefferson would have thought about the NAWAC's efforts to bring the wood ape into the light of the world?
That's a good question, Brandon. It's an interesting question because I have to say I think I know Mr. Jefferson pretty well. I'm a pretty diligent student of his. And I have to say that Jefferson was always looking to new discoveries. He was very interested in new theories. He was always interested in things that would challenge the status quo. He had a very open and very receptive frame of mind. He always looked forward to new discoveries, new scientific speculation. In fact, when he sent Lewis and Clark west to explore North America, he had every hope. He actually believed that they would find living mastodons. So I've got to think that I think he would be rooting for us in a major way.
That's amazing, and a bit of history I absolutely was not aware of prior to that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Jefferson's a cool dude, man.
Well, I'm definitely very confident that this group will accomplish its mission. And so what I would like to see in the future are students like yourself studying about the NAWAC and reading your name in those history books as well. So we greatly appreciate you being here and greatly appreciate your contributions to this group.
Well, it's my pleasure, Matthew. Thank you.
Well, Brandon, let's get right into this episode. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy it. You're going to be hearing us speak with various members of the NAWAC about their backgrounds and their experiences and how that informs their actions as citizen scientists. And Brandon, you also had a discussion with a wildlife professional outside of our organization who's interested in our data collection. Can you tell us a little bit about what to expect there?
In September of 2018, you and I, Matt, were in Area X, and we actually heard this together. We heard a series of sustained moaning howls that we were actually able to capture on one of our autonomous recording units. And I took that file from the autonomous recording unit and I sent it around to different wolf biologists around the continent. And the data that we collected actually came back as being well within the vocal range of red wolves. So I interviewed Kim Wheeler, the executive director of the Red Wolf Coalition out of North Carolina, who has vast experience with red wolves, about the history of the red wolf and about those files as well.
You know, Brandon, you reaching out to Kim and taking the time and energy to send those files is exactly what citizen science is about. It's not exactly directly related to what we're looking for, but you know that there are probably professionals and scientists out there who might be looking for something that we have. And you are also willing to get the opinion of a qualified individual to weigh in on this. So that's conducting citizen science kind of at its best, which I think this group is very good at doing in terms of sharing and disseminating data.
For sure. And I don't consider our organization just a conservation group for wood apes. I always look at the Ouachita Mountain ecoregion as the entire biome. So if we are able to prove the existence of the wood ape and thereby giving it protection status, we are also protecting everything that lives in that region, including the possible red wolves that we may have recorded.
That's a perfect way to sum up the overall mission of this particular group and the conservation portion of the group's focus. And so now our listeners are going to hear a bit from a number of different members of the NAWAC who are contributing to that very cause. Our Our next guest today is Mike Mayes. Mike is a board member of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, is a professional educator, a blogger at texascryptidhunter.blogspot.com, and an author. How you doing there today, Mike?
I'm doing great, Matt. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks so much for being here. I think the listeners would benefit a lot from hearing about your background in terms of, your professional background, your education, and your interest in cryptozoology and specifically in wood apes. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. As far as what I do for a living, I've been a teacher and a coach for 20 plus years. Coached everything from football to golf. About all I have not coached is soccer and swimming. I think those are the only two I haven't been involved with at some point or another. I'm a teacher of history, taught American history, and currently teaching Texas history in a middle school here in Killeen ISD. I grew up in southeast Texas, which falls into that piney woods region of Texas, heavily forested, lots of creeks and rivers, and all the main rivers of Texas seem to kind of taper down, get closer together now as they empty into the Gulf of Mexico there. So grew up with a lot of stories about what might be running around out in the woods, in particular the Big Thicket National Preserve, which was real close to where I grew up.
So you mentioned hearing kind of colloquial stories there in your area about some strange things running around in the woods. Was that the first introduction that there might be undiscovered animals in these parts of North America?
Possibly. I was pretty young, so I'd have a hard time putting a finger on the exact moment when I realized there might be something undiscovered running around in the woods close to me. We had heard stories of the wildman. That was typically what we heard about, running around in the Big Thicket. Around the Saratoga area, Village Creek, places like that. The term Bigfoot, Sasquatch, things like that, those weren't used in the mid to late 70s when I was kind of getting interested in this. It was a while before I kind of put together in my own mind that what the locals were talking about running around in our woods might be the same animal that they were talking about might exist up in the Pacific Northwest. So when I put that together, kind of the light bulb went off and, I was hooked pretty well from then on.
And at what point did that interest kind of shift from kind of casual observing and reading about it into getting involved and pursuing the things in the field yourself?
Well, I was pretty deep into life, so to speak. I was in my mid-30s. The interest had never gone away. I continued to read, and as the internet became a big thing, it became accessible to all of us. I started to dig around on the internet, and what a disappointment that was. A lot of that stuff out there was really, just silliness as far as I was concerned. That kind of turned me off a little bit, and it was actually, I was a member of an outdoors group, a Christian outdoors group, and I went to hear a speaker talk on Bigfoot in Texas, and it was our own Daryl Collier who was giving the talk. And I talked to him after the presentation. Again, my interest had never gone away, but he was really the first one to seem halfway sane in my mind that talked about the topic. And it really drew me toward the group. I did not join right then, but that really encouraged me that there really were some people out there taking this seriously and looking into it.
I can definitely empathize with being turned off at the amount of blatant nonsense that exists online in relationship to these animals. I can imagine that there were elements of Daryl's talk that allowed you to see that there are people who are approaching this from the standpoint of citizen scientists, people who are trying to apply known scientific disciplines and methods in order to bring closure or a conclusion to this particular mystery. And so did that inspiration eventually lead you into joining the group and becoming a part of those field efforts?
Yes and no. It inspired me, and there was a friend with me at the meeting where we heard Daryl speak, who was also interested, and we decided, we would, go look around a little on our own. We had, thanks to Daryl, we now knew the group website, and there was a map of sightings, and we saw that there were sightings in Montgomery County and Walker County, and not too far away from us. This was really encouraging to us, as we didn't have the time or the or the means necessarily to go back and forth to Washington and Oregon and places like that. So we decided to go look around for ourselves. And, we probably had gone out on, 2-3 day camping trips 4 or 5 times when we actually had a visual, and it was, it was pretty amazing. And we talked to each other about it, and we're like, no one's going to believe us. We're rank amateurs, beginners. No one is going to believe us. There have been people that have looked for these things for their entire lifetime and never seen one, and no one's going to believe this. So we sat on it for months, and that happened in May of 2005. I think it was October before finally I kind of worked my nerve up, and I told my buddy that, hey, I'm gonna go ahead and just report this to the group, and so I did. And Daryl's the one who followed up with me about it, and he did believe me, so that really kind of made me feel better. And at that point, that's when we decided to go to a meeting, and we joined in December of 2005.
It's fascinating that you did have a visual encounter and visual confirmation, visual contact with one of these animals early on, because a big part of what the NAWAC is doing in this context of operating as citizen scientists is trying to answer this fundamental question: do these animals exist? I think for a lot of people, there's this dividing line that they either don't exist, which means that they're the product of wishful thinking and misidentification and outright fabrication or some sociocultural phenomenon. And then on the other side of that dividing line is this possibility that they are real flesh and blood corporeal animals that have a distinct lineage and potentially connected to fossil animals. So in your experience, is it difficult to operate in a way that is trying to answer that question scientifically to the satisfaction of the greater scientific community, or let's say governmental or academic institutions, when you've already had this kind of personal confirmation of the answer to that fundamental question?
At times it is. It certainly is. Early on, I did realize that my having seen something is not proof to anyone else. And when I started, that's all I was trying to do, was just prove it to myself. We'd actually had a talk, my friend and I, that if we ever just found a big footprint out in the middle of nowhere where nobody would be out walking barefoot, that'd be enough proof for us. We would then know, and that would be enough. But after it happened, I was just so intrigued, and so that's how I got into this with the NAWAC. And my buddy, he's satisfied. He has his own personal knowledge, and he's happy with that. And I wanted to do more, and it is a challenge. And as technology has just taken leaps forward, even things like video or photographs are not going to serve as proof. So it is a challenge. It is frustrating, but you persevere. But there is a constant internal struggle, because you do have an internal bias to some degree, because you've seen one. I know they're there, and it can be frustrating because the guy you're with knows, but the people with the power to protect habitat, to list the species on the endangered species list, those people don't know. They haven't seen. So it is a constant struggle to try to get someone to listen to you and to open their eyes. It is a struggle.
To your point, if you want to prove it to yourself, you're probably going to have the most fun with this subject, because at that point you can set the bar as high or as low as you like. I always tell people, if you want to prove it to other people, well, now you've got a much bigger challenge, and it's not going to be as fun. It's going to be a lot more arduous. And then beyond that, if you're trying to prove it to the world, and again, those scientific, academic, and governmental institutions, well, now you've got a massive challenge, because you have to play by their rules. And science has laid out the rules for us very clearly over the last 60 plus years. And so I think it's very commendable to be willing to answer that question to the satisfaction of those outsiders, rather than just being content with having already answered it for yourself.
Right. It depends on what your goal is. Like you said, if it's just personal knowledge, I think you could have a lot of fun doing this. And there are a lot of people doing that, and that's perfectly fine. I want to do more. I want to contribute to the knowledge base that we have on these animals. I want them to be protected. And you're right. You have to know what the rules are, and you have to play by those rules. And we just have to keep trying. We're not going to get what we need by watching cable television shows about the subject. So that's the challenge. It's hard. It's unpleasant. It's uncomfortable. It's either boiling hot or freezing cold, or it's mosquitoes are eating you alive. You're traipsing through knee-high water sometimes. You're in swampy, marshy areas, or you're trying to climb mountains and snake-infested creeks. And I mean, it's difficult, and that's just something not everybody wants to do. And I get that, but that's what makes it such a challenge.
Being a professional educator and obviously having gone through the academic process, do you find that there are aspects of your education and training and profession that kind of inform your actions as a citizen scientist within the context of this particular group?
With any discipline, it wouldn't necessarily have to be education, so to speak, but with any discipline, there are just times when you just got to put your head down and plow through it. It's not necessarily pleasant or easy at the moment, but certainly the process of trying to get through to young people can be very discouraging at times when they're not interested in what happened 200 years ago. The challenge is making it relevant somehow to them today. And it's easy to get discouraged when it doesn't seem like you're making any progress in that regard, but you keep plugging away. And every now and then you get just a nugget where some kid will say, "Oh, okay, I get it. It's like this." And it's clear to you the light bulb went off in their mind, and they did get it, and they do understand. And those are good moments. And I think that somewhat correlates. I mean, we go, and I've always said that doing this type of research is, it's 99% boredom, basically. I mean, nothing's going on most of the time, at least as far as you know. And then there's 1% of just craziness, terror sometimes, and just the adrenaline rush is amazing when something does take place. But you plug away, and that satisfaction you get, when you experiment, you try and fail, you adjust, you try, you fail, you adjust. And then when you get something, that's what the process is all about. And that's pretty exciting stuff when that happens.
So given your expertise and your experience, not only in this group, but in other aspects of cryptozoology, I know you've authored a couple of books and you maintain a regularly updated blog on the topic. And I understand that you get a lot of speaking engagements and a lot of requests for that public outreach. So I'd love to hear a bit about what you see in the general public from multiple age groups in terms of their interest to this subject and their interest to the kind of work that the NAWAC is doing.
I think what helps the most is for them to see someone who speaks passionately on the subject, who is trying to use scientific protocols, and who is serious about it. I went and spoke to a group of Bell County master naturalists about a year ago. It was right after I had published a book on the Black Panther phenomenon. And that's actually what the topic was, as opposed to the wood ape subject. But you could feel the skepticism in the room when I came in. People were cordial, they were civil, but you can almost feel like, oh, this is, we must be scraping the bottom of the barrel for speakers or topics if this is what we're talking about at our monthly meeting. But by the time it was over, there were a dozen people who were in line to come talk to me. And you could just feel the shift in the room, the climate, so to speak, as I talk, because they realize, okay, he's not crazy. He's actually got some stuff here to back up what he's saying. They're citizen scientists. Master naturalists are citizen scientists. Their goals are different than ours, but they could see that while my subject area was different, I was one of them, and I was trying to do things the way they do things. I got done talking, and it was another 90 minutes before I got out of the room, because everybody knew somebody that had seen one of these big black cats, and they all wanted to tell those stories. And almost without exception, all of them said, I haven't told anybody about this, and then they would tell me their stories.
You mentioned that you had written a book on the topic of unidentified large cats. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
All over East Texas, where I grew up, you can't throw a rock in a room with 20 people and not hit somebody who's seen one or knows somebody who's seen one. Alton Higgins and I have talked about this and just chuckle, because every now and then he'll send me an email about, hey, I was just talking to so-and-so, and the next thing you know, he's talking about how they saw a black panther. And it's, it occurs much more often than the wood ape talk does. And when I started the blog, the intention was to talk about the whole Sasquatch wood ape phenomenon more than anything else. But I published a post about black panthers, and my email box just exploded. It was unbelievable. And just hundreds and hundreds of people sent me their accounts and stories, and I couldn't keep up. And I saved them all. It just kept going. Every time I would publish a post that talked about some of their accounts, it just triggered another avalanche of emails. And so after a few years of this, I thought, I should do something with this. To my knowledge, no one else had done a book-length project on the phenomenon. And so that was the genesis of the idea of writing the book. It's called Shadow Cats, the Black Panthers of North America. It mainly focuses on Texas and the American South, but I talk about accounts as far west as the Bay Area in California, as far north as Ontario, and as far east as the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida. And it's across the country. It's really amazing. And no doubt there's a lot of mistaken identity and things like that. But there's some of these accounts that are just really fascinating, including some accounts that our own Dr. Angelo Capparella collected when he was a younger man out in North Carolina, where he talked to wildlife officers. I think they're basically the equivalent of a game warden here in Texas, about sightings that they had. And so I took the most credible ones, charted them, see if there's any pattern to where these things are being seen, what might these things be, and talked to a lot of people, wildlife, big cat experts. We go into the history of sightings and all the way up to contemporary accounts. And so it was really a lot of fun for me to do. It turned out to be a much more difficult thing to do than I thought. But I think it came out pretty good, and I'm pleased with it. It was a labor. It was much more difficult. I don't think people realize how much goes into actually writing a book.
Mike, I can't thank you enough for appearing in this particular episode and talking with me today. Thank you so much for everything that you do for the NAWAC and for the subject in general. Listeners, please check out texascryptidhunter.blogspot.com or search for Shadow Cats in Amazon or other online book retailers. Mike, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Well, it was my pleasure as well. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome our guest at this time, calling in from somewhere in the woods in Oklahoma, NAWAC investigator Jody Blaylock. It is a pleasure to have you here, Jody. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, this phone call is great, and I'm excited about it because you and I have never actually talked before, so this is a great chance for you and I to get to know each other. I'm super curious about your background and the path that you took that led to us here having a conversation about wood apes on a podcast. So what do you do for a day job, Jody, if you don't mind me asking?
I am an architect. I was in the Army. I was a military police officer in the Army. And I lived in Arizona for 8 years. I was a EMT with search and rescue. One thing I really enjoyed I've always liked being outside, and I've always liked scary things. I think just being in search and rescue, it was awesome getting to hike outside, usually at night, because a lot of our calls came in later in the day. And I thought, when I moved back to Oklahoma, okay, it doesn't get any better than that. And then to put together being out at night, hiking in the woods, I mean, it's just, I don't know, to me, it's just like, it doesn't get better than this.
So you have become architect by day, wood ape hunter by night.
Yeah, that would be all. Wish I could do it every night, but.
Yeah, we all do. So how did you first become interested in the outdoors?
Well, I pretty much grew up outdoors. I was raised out in western Oklahoma. We had a wheat and cattle ranch. Actually, still have the same ranch in our family. So I've just always been outside. Our family went camping and hiking every summer in Colorado, and I grew up with horses, and my dad would take me hunting when he would go hunting. That was one of his big passions. So I've just, I guess, always just been an outdoorsy kind of person and try to spend more time outside than inside, honestly.
Yeah, it was the same way with me too. Growing up, I had kind of the same background in that my dad took me hunting, and we had family property that I grew up on, and that led to me just always wanting to be outside, wanting to be in the woods, hoping to find whatever kind of animal that I possibly could. What kind of game were you hunting?
Mostly quail. My parents actually met in Alaska, and my dad used to hunt, bear and mountain goat, and he would go on annual deer and elk hunts. But with him, we usually would hunt like quail, dove, and pheasant.
Game birds?
Yeah, just out on our farm usually, or other friends' farms.
So are you still on that same farm now?
I don't live there. It's a couple hours from where I live, but I still help manage the farm.
I imagine that led to you having some sort of interesting experiences being out there in Oklahoma in the woods.
Yeah, our farm's actually out in western Oklahoma, so it's pretty open where we are, just kind of rolling hill. Our farm's getting up toward what they call red carpet country, so mostly open, rolling prairie with some more heavily wooded areas along the creeks. But I'd actually, even out in western Oklahoma, I'd grown up hearing stories about, I guess, kind of mythical Native American type creatures out there, and have heard stories of what people normally call Bigfoot in that area as well, not just from Native American people, but from, just white and other people also. So it's something I'd always heard about and just found it interesting, later when I got older and heard more stories and got more into the Bigfoot side of things, it was just interesting to me that people from other places thought of Bigfoot as being kind of a Pacific Northwest dense forest type creature, where I'd grown up in western Oklahoma where we don't have dense forests, but I'd grown up hearing stories out there. So I always thought that was pretty interesting.
Do you remember what kind of stories that you heard growing up? I mean, it sounds like you had some quote unquote Bigfoot things imprinted on you from somewhat of an early age.
Yeah, I'd heard one story from one of my cousins. She actually grew up in northern Idaho. Her dad, my uncle, was a forest ranger, and she is a little bit older than me, but she, is a very wilderness savvy person. I mean, they always lived in really remote areas in northern Idaho and Montana. And when she was pretty young, she had been outside with a friend early one morning. It had just snowed, and they actually saw some tracks that they thought at first were some person walking barefoot in the snow. And they'd started to follow them and realized it doesn't make sense. Why would a human, one, have feet that big, and why would anyone be out here in the snow? And so I knew that she wasn't making that story up. So that was something that really impacted me. And then local stories here in Oklahoma, I would just hear people say things. I mean, the more credible and, I guess, detailed stories that I've heard have been more recent, since I've moved back to Oklahoma and really have been interested in, the whole Bigfoot wood ape thing, and been talking to a lot of people. But I've heard a lot more very detailed encounters. But when I was little, it was more just, I wasn't sure. I don't know if I really thought it was true, or I just thought it was exciting and I wished it was true. But you'd hear stories about people seeing some ape thing, messing around their property or hiding and peeking out from behind trees, looking at them when they were out hunting. So just not necessarily Bigfoot specific, but just more like there's a boogeyman kind of thing out there. But looking back, I think they probably were, just some credible accounts of something someone had actually seen.
So were you able to actually go out and start looking for quote unquote Bigfoot activity, or did you have to wait a while?
When I was younger, I don't think I really thought of it as being something real. I just thought of it as more a fun story. And it wasn't until, I'd done a number of different things in life and different career, moves, and had moved away from Oklahoma and moved back about, 4 years ago. And honestly, part of why I moved back was because I've been hearing more and more stories about people doing Bigfoot research in Oklahoma, and just thought, if there's something in my home state for real, I want to be a part of that. Like, I want to be in the middle of that. And so when I first moved back, I didn't know there were Bigfoot groups. I didn't know those really existed. And so I ended up going to a festival that wasn't a very good festival. It was kind of silly, but I met a couple people there with common interests, and a couple ladies in particular, and we went camping on several occasions, just basically novices, just interested in the idea of Bigfoot, kind of excited, just want to go camping anyways. And that's when I actually had my first experiences that made me realize, this could be real.
What happened?
We were camping, and the first thing that happened was I was walking with a friend, and we both had headlamps on, and we saw this rock come flying out of nowhere, and it landed right in front of us. And it happened. We both heard it hit the ground. We could feel the impact on the ground. We both had headlamps on, so we saw it. And there was just absolutely no one in the direction where the rock came from. And it was just one of those things that was just almost mind-boggling. Like, did that really just happen? I mean, I know it happened, and the person I was with, experienced the same thing. And there was just absolutely no explanation for it. I was like, okay, I can't argue with that. I mean, I know it happened. I can't explain it. I think at that point I was still like, it could have been someone playing a joke on us. Other people could have been around. Maybe we just didn't know they were there. It was just so bizarre. That same camping trip, it was very early one morning, and it was just before daybreak. I was asleep in the cabin, and all of a sudden I was just wide awake. I sat there for a minute, like wondering, like, what woke me up? And then I started hearing these whooping sound. And it wasn't just like you hear the recordings of one single whoop. This was like, 7 or 8 of them in a row. And I remember just sitting there just like mind-boggling, just like, what on earth is that? And it was just like, a hair on the back of your neck kind of cold chill feeling, because I'm like, I don't know what that is. Like, I've been outside most of my life, and I've never heard anything like that. I have no clue what that thing is. And so I was freaked out, and I looked over at the other 2 ladies, and they were sound asleep. And I'm just thinking, how can anyone sleep through this? Like, this is incredible. Now I see why people miss recording things and taking pictures, because I was so engrossed in what I was hearing. It just didn't even occur to me that I should record it until it was over. And so I went outside, and I didn't see anything. And we were, the cabin was in a pretty large cleared area. And I realized whatever that was, because I heard it inside the cabin, and it was pretty loud. I mean, I could tell it was coming from a distance, but it was a loud sound. And I realized, okay, whatever it was pretty far away. I mean, probably at least 100 yards or more away. But it still was, my impression was this was a large animal. And so I went outside, just sat there for a while, didn't hear anything else, didn't see anything. And then I started thinking, okay, this was probably a joke. And there were some other people camping in other cabins, and I thought, all right, I'm gonna figure out who did this. And so I kind of hid on the porch of our cabin, and I thought, I'm gonna sit here and wait, and I'm gonna catch whoever was doing that coming out of the woods. And I sat there until the sun started to come up, and eventually I saw every single person come out of their cabin. And again, I'm like, okay, I don't know who else would have been out here and why anyone would come before dawn to play a joke on us. So when I went home, I kept thinking, well, maybe it was a bird. Maybe it was, I don't know, something I'm not familiar with. So I spent hours just going on the internet, trying to look for different birds from that area, different mammal sounds. And the only thing that it sounded like was I finally found a recording of a gibbon. I mean, that was what I heard almost exactly.
I think it takes a lot of guts, and I have to commend you for going outside and investigating it on your own. I think a lot of people would roll over and go back to sleep and maybe put the pillow over their heads and pretend that they didn't hear anything.
Yeah, I think I was just like, I have to know what that was. Like, I can't identify it.
So I imagine then that curiosity about having to know what made that sound is what led you to the NAWAC?
Actually, I still didn't even know that the NAWAC existed. I think it was the next year, I actually ended up going to a Bigfoot festival, and I was not very impressed. I was very disgruntled. I was very disappointed in the festival because it seemed to be a lot of just kind of goofy ideas and paranormal type things. And so that was really my only interaction with, I guess, the Bigfoot world at that point. And I was pretty disappointed and just thought, okay, I think if my experience would stop there, I'd be done with it and just think, okay, these guys are a bunch of kooks. I'm not going to have anything to do with this. I'll just chalk up the experiences I've had to some freak occurrence. So I was at this festival and I was getting ready to leave. And I thought, well, before I leave, I'll just grab lunch. So I got some food and I went outside on the porch area and sat down to eat. And I ended up sitting down next to Marvin Leeper and John Harrell. And so we started talking and they started telling me, okay, look, it's not always like this. Like, there are other people, there are normal people who take, very scientific approach to this. I think I was just hooked at that point. Like, okay, I want to know more about this. I want to meet these people. I want to meet more of these people and who have really had experiences, and have a scientific, realistic approach to what this is. And so that's how I found out about NAWAC. And I'm really glad, because if I had not run into Marvin and John, I would probably just be done with it at that point.
Going into Area X, what was your skepticism level at in regards to the existence of wood apes? And do you think that the habitat could support wood apes if you thought they existed?
Area X was awesome. It was so exciting, and it was more than what I expected. I mean, it was just, I think just being there, I felt like I was in this famous place, that I had heard about for so long. And we did quite a bit of hiking, which was awesome. At night, we would hear wood knocks and strange whistle sounds. So you know something's there. And I think probably the most telling or the most exciting thing that we had happen, honestly, if I would have been alone, I wouldn't have paid much attention. It was really early one morning, and Elton and I were the only two awake. We'd woken up because we kept hearing noises, and we heard like a wood knock, and so I knew something was out there. We just couldn't see it. And so the two of us had gotten up out of our tent, and we were looking with the thermals and just kind of being quiet and watching and listening. And after a while, we heard this huff. And I just immediately thought, oh, it's a dog. And Alton said, that's what we're looking for. And I started thinking, I think because I've heard some of the podcasts saying you automatically start trying to identify what it is. And if you can't identify it, you just associate it with something that you do know. So we heard this strange noise, and I just thought, oh, it's a dog. And it wasn't until Elton pointed it out that, I started thinking, no, well, we haven't seen any dogs here. We haven't seen any tracks. It didn't really sound like a dog. It just sounded more like a dog than anything else. It was like a deep, low huff. It sounded like a really, really large dog, like a Mastiff or a Rottweiler or something, like a deep, deep, low huff. And it was just one sound, fairly loud, very distinct. And so that to me was just like, it was just confirmation for me that there's something here and I don't know what it is. So I can't wait to go back.
Yeah, I think the only possibilities for that would be bear or wood ape.
Yeah, I have a good friend of mine who's a primatologist. I asked her, do apes make sounds like that? And she said, yes, sometimes, what she described and what I, found some recordings on the internet. I'm like, yep, that's what I heard. Something very similar to that. So I can't explain why I would have heard that in southeastern Oklahoma. Once you go into Area X and see, I've camped quite a bit in southeastern Oklahoma. I'm familiar with that area. I thought where I had been before was densely vegetated. This was, I couldn't believe I was in Oklahoma, honestly. So just walking around those woods and just realizing even in the middle of the day, it was hard to keep visuals on, the people you were hiking with. You got separated a little. And we weren't even that far apart sometimes, and you would just lose track of where they were. And the way sound is kind of muffled there. It was shocking to me, one, as someone growing up in Oklahoma, that I was still in Oklahoma. But I just thought, there could be something, very close to us, just sitting there watching us, and you wouldn't see it. Being out there and realizing how dense the vegetation is, even at night. Like one night, I think it was a possum or something on the ground, and we could hear it and see it, like put a light on it and see it with a thermal, and then it would just disappear behind some really dense vegetation. And it was pretty convincing for me. Like there could be something pretty close. I can see how you wouldn't realize it. So I think as far as skepticism, I'm not 100%, I believe that there is something there. I think part of it for me now is I just want to see it for myself and know absolutely without a doubt that yes, this is here.
You start to get that itch to go back to X not very long after you leave.
I was looking forward to going back while I was still there.
I'm happy to hear that your first week there went well.
Yeah, I can't wait to get back.
I'm sitting next to a bubbling brook in one of the most picturesque and beautiful areas you probably will find anywhere around here. And that's kind of a funny thing to say because honestly around here there's got to be 1,000 of these beautiful picturesque areas. But today I'm sitting with a member of the NAWAC that I'm going to interview. His name is Rich. Say hello, Rich.
Hello.
You may have noticed that Rich has a bit of an accent. We're here today to learn about Rich, find out why he is interested in this subject, what his experiences have been that have led him here to this valley in this group. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Rich?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Manchester in the north of England. I'm an army officer. I live now down near London. I've been in the military since the early 80s, so that makes me pretty much of a veteran. I joined as a private. I've been armoured infantry, a paratrooper, and now I'm serving as a staff officer as a major with a reserve unit near home. I bumped into a wood ape as such in 2011 in Alberta in Canada. I birdwatch as a hobby, and I was out birdwatching early hours of the morning. I'd seen the target species, switched to a scree slope in the hope of seeing a grizzly, and a 7.5 feet at least bipedal hairy creature walked out on the scree slope in front of me. From then on, my world turned upside down.
So when the thing walked out, what did you think when you saw this thing walk out on the scree slope? And about how far away was it from you?
I reckon probably about 300, 400 meters. I was looking up the scree slope, and this thing walked out. And initially, I was told those scree slopes were really good for grizzly. So within seconds, almost seconds of setting up to look, this brown thing walked out, and I thought, oh, grizzly. That was quick. Quickly realizing that it was on two legs and it was walking with a purpose across the scree slope. So I spent probably about 30 seconds on and off as it disappeared in the top of the trees looking at it. Getting particularly animated in the valley, it saw me and just dropped out of sight and never saw it again.
And you're from Manchester, as you say. You're from the UK. How many times before this had you ever thought of Bigfoot or wood apes?
There was a kids program on when I was a child called News Round, so it was news specifically for children, and they showed the PG film as something that was a bit of a surprise. And this must have been in the 1970s, so a number of years afterwards. I looked at it and not convinced. And as I grew older and got into natural history, it just slipped out of my mind. There was no way there was going to be an undocumented large ape wandering around North America with the amount of people you have wandering around the woods. So it became a massive shock when I did actually see one.
So when you saw it, did you immediately think that you recognized that as potentially a Bigfoot like the PG film, or did you have to stew on that for a while? What was your process?
No, there was no doubt what I was looking at that point. There was an ape. I've got my notebook at home, which has got a list of boreal forest birds, and then Sasquatch in capital letters with a number of exclamation marks at the side of it. I remember sitting and jumping in the car. I'm led by food big time, and I was hungry. It was early in the morning. I wanted to go for breakfast, and I was driving down the road. Mind all a blur. I can't remember much of that journey. And when I got to the cafe, ordered breakfast and a coffee, I just wanted to stand up and shout, "I've just seen a Sasquatch." But of course, you don't do those sort of things.
You do, but you then get thrown out of the restaurant. Yeah. So how long after that did you find our organization, and how did you come across the NAWAC?
Yeah, I'd been reaching out to a number of people, and I discovered Twitter quite early. So I tweeted a couple of Canadians. They put me through to BFRO, and I put my sighting in. And then I thought it was probably wise to contact a number of American organizations. I found NAWAC, contacted them, and they were the only ones to reply.
Really?
Yeah. So
BFRO just...
No, I was interviewed by BFRO.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But the only ones to reply after that, when I started gaining more interest, was NAWAC.
Right. How long have you been a member now?
Good question. 5 years.
Wow, has it been that long?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're down here in the valley that we call Area X. How many times have you been here so far?
This is my third time now. So the first time 2 years ago was a long weekend, Friday till Monday. Expecting possibly one wood knock that weekend. I started ticking off wood ape behaviour pretty quickly after that. Hoops, howls, wood knocks, a banshee, which was pretty freaky.
That was creepy.
And then the finale was a tree peeker through opticals at night.
Yeah, so I'll set the stage on that. I was here with Rich, myself and Daryl Collier. It was just the three of us, and we were sitting in camp. It was a dark camp, which is what we like to do. No lights, no fire, just pitch black. And Rich, who apparently has bionic eyes, was first to spot this. What did you see?
It was two green eyes, which I initially thought were stars because it was up the ridge. And the more I looked at the top of the trees and the more I looked at the sky and then looked at these two dots, it was obviously not stars.
Right.
So I called out eyes. You two, I remember, were behind me looking up. Couldn't see a thing.
See it at all.
So I'm thinking I'm going mad at this point, and then you both pulled out optics,
Right.
and you picked them up.
So I have a third gen night vision unit, which is pretty good at seeing things in the dark, but it does need some ambient light. So when I looked through my night vision, I could see the eye shine that Rich was seeing. I could only see it through my night vision. Daryl had our thermal unit, and he could see the thermal outline of what appeared to be a head coming around. So in this spate of just a few moments, we had a visual with natural eyesight. We could see the creature through night optics, through IR optics, and then we saw it again through thermal. All of us seeing it in different ways. How long did this escapade last?
It seemed like hours, but probably about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
I think it's when you nipped off and looked up the slope with your head torch.
Yeah.
I was looking at it through I can't remember, probably your optics, and the creature just dropped and we never saw it again.
Yeah. I had to go and relieve myself, and looking up the slope, I sort of glanced. I wasn't even paying any attention to what I was doing. I had my red headlamp on, and just that motion made it. It was so skittish. I think at that point it knew that we were looking at it. I think the most memorable part that I have of that event is when I was looking at it through the thermal, and you could actually see on the left hand side of the tree as I was facing it. So the animal's head was poking out, and on the opposite side there were little heat signatures of these little sort of like things creeping around that that really only could have been fingers. So that was a remarkable event. That was your first time in X.
That was.
Yeah.
I didn't think I'd surpassed my sighting in Alberta. I've sort of forgotten about that now because what I've experienced in X over the last 3 trips, just beyond anything I could have hoped for.
So let's flash forward to last year when you were here. You did something really interesting with Daryl that trip. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, last year Daryl and I were dropped off 2 or 3 drainages away, and over 2 days we walked back in terra incognito, so places nobody had ever been to before, in the hope of flushing something. The first day we had pretty much no sightings, nothing happened whatsoever. We camped that night. I possibly saw something. I'm still not convinced. It might have been something akin to a chimp's head looking at us. It could have been pareidolia. I'm still open to what that was. The following day, we moved off early hours, walked through the day. We were getting to a point where both of us completely knackered. It was time to either camp where we were or push on for another 2 hours with head torches on and get back to Camp David. We didn't. We put up a tent, sat around, talked for a few hours, had something to eat. 10:15, we went to bed. I fell asleep within about 10 minutes, 3 wood knocks, and then the rest of the night it was pretty much 10 minutes sleep every hour, 50 minutes. I won't describe it as terror, but being completely uncomfortable as we were being huffed at, growled at.
You're inside the tent when this is happening.
We were inside the tent, and at one point I was asleep. I was surprised I ever went to sleep that night, to be honest. I think at the point where my body just shut down, I was woken by Daryl, who said he'd just seen a figure walk up to the tent. We had a red light outside. That figure walked in between the tent and the light, and then turned off at a tangent and wandered off. So we left it for another couple of hours, things happening every now and again, mouth pops, wood knock, growls, huffs. We got out, stood there in our underwear, because it was hot that night, with pistols in hand, looked over the creek, and there's a pair of green eyes looking at us, crouching down in the undergrowth. Both of us taunting it, shouting at it, nothing happened. It eventually just disappeared. I still can't remember how it disappeared, to be honest. That's
sort of unnerving.
Yeah, because it was there, and then it wasn't. Yeah. I think at that point we were getting to the point where sleep was just calling. We went back to our tent, and then eventually Daryl had enough. His light outside had the ability to turn from red light to white light. He turned it to white light at about 4 a.m, 5, maybe 4:30, and then everything stopped.
Right. That's fascinating, and I know that what you're talking about. I've been in here, and I mean, you guys had just had essentially 2 days of really strenuous hiking through just open country, and sometimes you just become so tired that no matter what's happening around you, you just can't stay awake. So you guys came back to camp and related the story to us, and this was an area that I don't think anybody in our group that I can think of off the top of my head, certainly no one who was there that weekend had ever been to before. On the other side of the valley, up a drainage, and so we quickly determined that we wanted to go back. Did you want to go back, or did you sort of agree to go back?
No, I didn't. Do you know what was? We were sat there, and you were saying, "I want one of you to take us back." Right. I didn't particularly want to go back, and I knew we went back during the day and wrecked the place, but the nighttime trip I wasn't keen. And then Daryl said, "Oh, he was going to stay in camp," and I thought, well, this may never happen again. Right. So I went back. And as you know, we were again hammocks up. We spent the early evening chatting. We went to sleep with nothing happening, and that was rather disappointing at that point, because I thought I've just taken to a place where we had lots of action.
Yeah, it's a hard walk to get over there, and I'm like, I came all the way over here, and I'm gonna lay in a hammock all night, and jack squat is happening.
So then, 1:53. That's imprinted on my brain. I was asleep. I wasn't sleeping particularly well when I heard rock displacement in the creek in front of us. I sat up, and directly behind me was a human-like, very loud whistle. So I shouted, "I've been whistled at." No, nothing whatsoever. Really loudly, "People, I've just been whistled at." At what point, Brian, Brandon, and Matt woke up. Matt immediately whistled back and got a mouth pop from something to our left.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't immediately respond. So it was myself, it was you, it was Brandon Lentz, our co-host, and actually our other co-host, Matt Pruitt. We're all down there. But that was it that night. That was all we had. We had that one whistle mouth pop, right?
No.
What else happened that night?
More mouth pops, lots of hoofs.
Yeah.
I think is the best way to say it. Hoof, hoof.
Yep.
In the distance, I reckon 3, 4, maybe 5 apes around us all night.
It was one of those rare instances where you really felt like they were all around you, and it's kind of hard to believe. And I'm sure some people are going to hear that and just not believe it. But there were minimally 3, just based on where we were hearing the sounds from.
Yeah. And very close. I think whether they'd seen people before is probably open to debate, but they were massively curious, and they were coming in close. I mean, the thing that's worried me, and it has actually worried me for a year now, is that when I was lying in that hammock, there was something behind me just watching me. Yeah. That's rather off-putting, to be honest.
Yeah. They're kind of creepy, the way they just sit there and stare at you. So as we've been talking over this trip and previous trips, you've done quite a bit of what I would call sort of naturalist type activities. What are some of the things you've done that are related to your birding or other types of what we might describe as citizen science?
Yeah, I'm a member of an army. We have an army ornithological site in the British Army. Plenty of members who do bird watch. We've actually got special forces guys who spent their time lying in ditches in the middle of Northern Ireland or the jungles of Belize, and then got into bird watching by just watching things because they were bored. So we do a number of things. We've been doing a project on Ascension Island in the South Atlantic since 1989. So every 9 months or so, we go back and study seabird colonies on Ascension. There was an issue on Ascension Island that the seabirds have all moved onto outlying islands because feral cats had taken them all over the years. So we set up a project where the government employed New Zealanders to come in, eradicated the cats, and the seabirds have now moved back onto Ascension. So good news story, really.
And you actually, there's a little area near where you live that you go and you're constantly sort of inventorying the animals there.
Yeah, I keep out of trouble, as I say to my wife. I don't think I have an expensive hobby. I could be a soccer fan. Well, I am a soccer fan, but I could be paying £200 every weekend to go and watch my team up in the north of England. So I spend my time helping out on what was a gravel pit in the south of England has now been restored into a nature reserve. So I'm pretty much in the outdoors all the time. Right. I don't get the outdoors as it is here, and this is my fix every year. We try to travel as a family to different places all over the world we've never been to. I try to get as remote as possible, but this is probably the most remote I've ever been. And I've been to Nepal, I've been to Africa, I've been to Australia, but wherever I've been, you could walk out within a few hours and find civilization. Here I'd probably have problems doing that.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know, since you're relatively new, this is your 3rd trip, so you're becoming a grizzled old hand, but the first time you came in here, coming down that road, what were your impressions of this place? Did it live up to expectation? Did it exceed expectation?
Well, I mean, driving down the road, there were stick insects or walking sticks all over the windscreen. I'd probably only ever seen 2 in my life, and at one point the windscreen wipers were going, and there was 30 or 40 going each time, and there's this tunnel of vegetation. Now, I've been on the roads in Africa. There's been some grim roads, but this tunnel of vegetation as we slip down a hill in low ratio to get to this place I'd never been to. My wife thought it was really odd. I was meeting a lot of Americans with guns that I'd only ever spoken to on the internet, and at that point there was a bit of a banjo moment as I'm driving down this hill thinking, who am I meeting? Yeah.
I think I know exactly the area, and I think I know exactly the spot you're thinking about, because I had a similar thought the first time I went down there, because it looked like I was about to fall into a bottomless crevasse. So you've spent time in here. How does it, the wildlife, the diversity, what do you think? Could this place sustain a population of giant primates?
Without a doubt. I've been in the jungle, and this is jungle. Yeah. In most respects, this is jungle. If anybody's ever been into a jungle, you get claustrophobic very quickly. And actually, if you sit in certain places, you're miles from anywhere, but you can get claustrophobic in the outdoors. Right. Nothing I've experienced really, apart from places in Africa and Asia.
Yeah. But that happens to you here.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
Well, Rich, I really appreciate you spending time talking to me today, and thanks so much. And here's hoping we have more adventures together down here in Area X.
Happy days.
So I am here in the valley we call Area X, and I am joined by NAWAC investigator David Herring. Each of us has taken a different path to wind up in this place, and I'd like to get to know about yours. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thank you, Brandon.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and what led to your interest in the outdoors?
So it's sort of a circuitous path. When I was a younger child, we lived in Northern California. We spent a good deal of time in the Sierras going up there. We'd fish, we'd camp, we'd hike. This was in the early 70s, mid 70s. So Bigfoot was a hot topic. So that was always one of the boogeymen I had to deal with. I was always one of the younger kids in the group of people that we would go with. And that was when I was young. When I was 11 or 12, we moved to Texas, and all of that stopped. So there wasn't much outdoors going on as I grew up the rest of the way until I got later in life and was an adult. Changed jobs, opened our own business. We opened an insurance agency, and that afforded me time to do things on my own. It afforded me to the ability to do research on my own, and get back outdoors, which I realized I really missed and really loved. Along those same lines, one of the things I was researching, I thought, you type in Bigfoot in a Google search, and one of the first things I found was a group called the Texas Bigfoot Research Center. And I thought, I got to check these guys out, and I did. So I drove out to a conference with a friend of mine. I recruited a friend of mine to go out there with the intent of seeing a bunch of crazy people, because that's all I knew of the subject at the time. And I was sorely disappointed. There were no tinfoil hats. There might have been some crazy people in the audience, but the speakers were all professional, we're all sane, we're all level-headed. And I remember distinctly coming home from that and my wife asking me, how was it? What'd you think of this? And I was kind of confused, and she was concerned that I didn't have a good time and it wasn't as fun as I thought it would be. But I couldn't quite square those things. That this topic that, since I was a kid, I thought was just kind of a fun thing. That there might actually be something to it. So I mulled this over for a few weeks and ended up finally going to, at this time, the Texas Bigfoot Research Center would have, I guess, monthly or bi-monthly meetings. And that's one of the ways you'd become a member. So I went to a few of those meetings and met some of the people and thought this might be a worthwhile endeavor. And so I signed up.
So at these meetings, when you were talking to these sober-minded scientific folks, did you have any indication or skepticism about their findings and the things that they had been presenting?
Oh, of course. I mean, that's kind of how I'm wired. I'm skeptical by nature. One of the things that I liked was they didn't accept any of that. They didn't accept any outlandish tales. They didn't accept anything that wasn't based in reason, So in these meetings, they would give you the opportunity to speak about your experiences, would ape related or not, and what brought you to the subject. And there'd be people in there that would have outlandish tales, and that would kind of get shut down. And I really appreciated that. It was a no nonsense kind of thing. And that led me to want to be a part of it,
And how long ago was that?
This would have been in 2007.
So that was way back before the years when we started having summer operations in here. Mm-hmm. When did you actually start going into the field with the interest in looking for wood apes?
Yeah. So I joined the group in 2007, spent a few years with them. We had young kids at the time. We were building a business. So I essentially took a sabbatical and stepped away for a few years to focus on other things. But as my availability of free time increased, I got back into it. This would have been in late 2014. And I guess 2015 would have been the first summer that I spent time in here.
So before your first trip into Area X, what would you say your opinion was on the actual existence of wood apes.
So that's a question you've asked me before, and generally it comes up at some point when I'm here in the field with people. They always want me to put a percentage on it, and so the first thing I'd tell you is when I'm here on a team, the assumption is wood apes are here. I'd be doing a disservice to you guys and the group as a whole if I came in with a different agenda, to prove it to myself or something like that. So the assumption for me has to be that to be a good team member has to be that they are here. Besides that, it's not a static thing for me. There's times that I think to myself, if there was something to this, it would have happened by now. That weighs on me at times. But then a week goes by, some time goes by, and I think about it. I hear about what's going on in the valley when I'm not here. I hear accounts from people that I know and trust. I come to the valley and I think there's no reason it couldn't be here. I mean, the habitat can certainly support it. And then that brings me back on board. So it's not a static thing for me. It ebbs and it flows, but regardless, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. Just natural history is a fun thing, and I think it's important to do these kind of things.
I think skepticism is healthy. I think that you are doing the right thing in putting yourself in a position to see or experience these kinds of wood ape activities that we're describing, and to essentially find out for yourself. I think that's good science. I think that's what good science is.
I agree. I'm wired skeptically, so I probably, everybody always asks a percentage. I won't be at 100% until I see one probably, but that's just the way I'm wired. That doesn't change the group or the group dynamic. But you got to come out here and see, and that's the only way it's going to happen for me personally. But again, me personally is not the goal. The goal is what the group wants to accomplish, and so that's the attitude I've got to be here with.
So you've been coming here since 2015. How has your opinion changed since then?
I'm less skeptical than I was in 2015. And I'll tell you, Brandon, it's not so much because of the things I've seen. I haven't spent a terrible amount of time in here. It's been a few weeks here and a few weeks there. But what erodes that skepticism for me is knowing people and getting to know the members of the group and hearing their accounts, and seeing, going to the places where they've had things happen, and seeing the valley itself. I mean, I said this earlier, there's no reason wood apes can't be in here. I mean, the habitat would support them. There's nothing prohibiting that. I told this story to you earlier in the week. Somebody once asked me after the first time in here in 2014, if I thought, a wood ape could possibly live in here. And my reply was real quick. I thought a T-Rex could live in here. It's just, it's that dense and it's that vast, and there's plenty of places for things to hide and stay hidden.
So what are some of the more compelling events that you've witnessed since your time in here?
Well, one of the ones that sticks out to me was the first 5 minutes that I was here, and it was with you, actually. It was your first time in, too, I believe. It was in January of 2015 we came in, and I think we'd been in the valley out of the trucks maybe 10 minutes at the most, and a rock came through the trees and hit one of the nearby sheds. And I remember one of the guys said, "Whoa," as it's coming through the trees, and we all looked at each other, and then a split second later was the impact. And that was real compelling to me. I mean, rocks don't just fly around, and the timing of it. I mean, it was within 10 minutes of us getting out of the truck. So that was real compelling. Seeing the reaction of other members that have seen things, whether it was this week or other times, that's compelling to me,
So there's obviously something here that keeps you coming back every year.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I want these things to be here. I'm rooting for this, but I've seen other people want it so bad that they fall off that slope, and I worry about that. So I'm gonna be guarded and just keep coming back until I'm at that 100% mark.
Our our next guests are two brothers originally from Missouri who have been invaluable NAWAC members for quite a while. I was fortunate enough to spend a week with them in the field this year during Delta Team, and I'd like to introduce them to you now, Bud and Mark Melliker. Bud, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, including your background, education, and profession?
Sure. I'm actually in my 60s, and I've had a background of loving nature and outdoors for our whole lives, my brother and I. My dad got us both hunting and fishing early. That's probably what instilled our love for the outdoors. And always curious about nature and wildlife. And that's kind of what brought us into this subject, for me personally, into this subject.
How about yourself, Mark? Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm 1 year younger than my brother, Bud. Like you said, we grew up in St. Louis area, and I ended up moving to Iowa City. Our mom and dad moved us there and went to college in Iowa. Was 2 years in geology and ended up getting a business degree instead, and I kind of regret that looking back, because I really liked the prospect of working in the field as a profession. As Bud said, we grew up walking around the Ozarks. My dad bought a plot of land in south central Missouri, and we spent most of our summers down there hiking and walking, and it's very similar to Area X. But anyway, we really became outdoor naturalist minded, and I think we were introduced to this subject early, probably Momo. That's pretty much my background. I was in financial services my career, always whenever had a chance, got out in nature, fished a lot, hunted, so forth.
So, Bud, I understand that you joined the NAWAC first out of the two of you. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was that captured your interest enough to move from being kind of a casual observer and reader of the subject to being involved directly in field research?
I think it was 2014. I live in the Tulsa area right now, Oklahoma, and my brother lived in the Chicago area. And I saw that the NAWAC was having their big conference in Fort Worth. And so we talked about it, and he actually ended up flying down. We drove down early in the morning on Saturday and went to their conference, and we were kind of blown away. I didn't expect, I expected maybe 20 people there. I didn't know what to expect, but it was very, very good. And we were all excited. So when we got back, I don't think I submitted an application. The thing was, I was still working, wasn't retired. I mean, I thought there's just no way I'm going to be able to help these guys in any shape or form, because I've only got limited vacation, blah, blah, blah. But I think after I retired, I sent an application in, and so did Mark. So that was like May 2016. But my first year in the field was 2017. But anyway, that's kind of the short version of it. I've been following the subject online, of course, for years. Never really was thinking about joining any group. And I came across these guys, and they're within hours of me, pretty close. And I thought, wow, this sounds like these guys are really scientifically oriented and seem straightforward. And I was just really turned on by that. So that's how I ended up joining them.
What I've been so impressed with, especially in the last few years, is just the wide array of skills that you both bring to this organization. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about that. I know you were both instrumental in building the cabin that we have on site at our particular location there in Area X now, which is just an invaluable resource. It's a remote, unforgiving area, so just having a roof over our heads is such a huge morale booster and really makes those weeks a lot more tolerable. And then beyond that, what I think the listeners would really be interested in hearing is some of the new techniques and technologies that we're trying to put to use in the field. The NAWAC had helmed a long-term camera trap project for quite a while, not without its own hurdles and obstacles, but now we're trying some different things. So, Bud, could you tell the audience a little bit about what we're doing now and the work you've done with the new camera technology that we're deploying?
When I joined as a camera person. So I was, of course, had my SLR and my lens, and we were walking around the woods. And I soon realized after being down there the first time that it was kind of a futile attempt. And I know these guys had all these camera trap setups prior. That was the main goal, was to get some photographic evidence. And so now, I think last year, I talked about doing it again. I had purchased a couple trail cameras, and then the organization purchased 6 this spring. And so we had to try to figure out a way to camouflage these things. And one of the issues too that we discussed is the fact that we think they have a sense of sensing IR light. So these IR flashes, infrared flashes that these cameras put off, were probably being sensed by these animals somehow. That was a possibility. So I ended up disabling the flash on these cameras, just going with daytime photos only, just because there was probably a risk that they were seeing these things and avoiding them. So the camouflage technique was what I got involved in a little bit. So ended up trying to use native bark on the native trees down there, a lot of shagbark hickories and the oaks and stuff, and hot gluing these pieces of bark to the cameras and then installing them on the trees and kind of brush them in. To some extent, they were successful. Some of them looked better than others. I think these animals are so wary and aware of their surroundings that they can spot these things. So this summer, we had them deployed throughout the field. We had 8 total. There was a team just down there a week ago. They checked all the cards, and there was a lot of deer, squirrels, black bear. We've had barred owls, turkeys, no apes. So one of the members here just recently in our discussions on our forum, we're discussing putting up these cameras in a different array, sort of a picket line would be a generic way of saying that, in one area of the valley, which I think we're going to pursue, which I'm excited about. Because otherwise, it's just pretty much a crapshoot of trying to win a lottery and have one of these animals make a mistake and walk in front of one of these cameras. But anyway, that's sort of what I did this summer. It's been fun.
Excellent. And I think listeners who are themselves field researchers might be interested to know how it is that you disabled those IR flashes, because one of the other benefits that we found inadvertently is that it seems to be that the IR flashes are what is the primary pull of the power source. So we found that cameras that might be eating through their battery source pretty quickly are actually not doing that. So we have these cameras out there that are taking thousands of photos over months of periods of time, but because there's no power going to those IR bulbs, we're finding that they're still at like 98, 99% capacity in terms of their power. So could you talk a little bit about how it is that you disabled those IR flashes?
Well, you're right about that. That's what I'm assuming about this power draw on these cameras. I mean, some of them were still at 100%. And so I think those IR flash bulbs are the main drain. But what I did was, of course, we have these new trail cameras. So I ended up opening the backs of them up and getting to the wires. I actually desoldered them, the wires that went to the IR flash units from the circuit board. A couple of the other members had their own personal cameras. I think they cut them, which is just fine. I wanted to be able to reestablish them if we wanted the IR back. But yeah, that's what I did. I opened them up, desoldered the wires, put them back together. Then I duct taped with camo duct tape all over the camera body, and then went to gluing bark pieces, which was kind of a tedious process, onto these cameras with hot glue gun. It worked pretty good. So that was the process.
Mark, one of the things that I was so impressed about was just your ability to manufacture and fabricate gear almost as an engineer. I was really impressed with the shooter chair that you built, as well as the additions to your field vehicle. Can you tell us a little bit about your process in terms of generating your own gear and any plans you might have for future gear and creating some of those things for field use in X?
When I first joined NAWAC, Bud had already been in to X with his vehicle, his truck, and he was complaining bitterly about scrapes down the side, and it was 2-wheel drive, and it was really not adequate for getting in and out of that area. So I had a Ford Expedition that had 200,000 miles on it, and had some age on it, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to equip that, and that'll be our vehicle to get in and out. So I ended up building bumpers for it and raising it and putting large AT tires on it, winch. Then I put a bunch of light bars on the top with a rack, just kind of an expedition type vehicle. And that kind of started the whole thing. Then the shooter chair idea came from the mobile Overwatch that we decided to try. So actually bought a used Coleman 10 on eBay, cut the windows out, put the black plastic in, which I think you saw that down in Delta. And then I would stand in there and say, well, how are we going to sit in this for 8 hours comfortably? And if the opportunity arises, take a shot accurately. So that's when I got online and started looking at shooting chair options and decided to purchase a couple of parts and modify it, put it together, and actually turned out to be kind of a nice, unique shooting chair, which, the first night Bud and I manned that Overwatch, I sat in it for, I think, probably 6-8 hours straight, and it was very comfortable. So it's just, it seems like if there's a need, I try to solve it by putting something together. If it's not a product you can just buy off the shelf, then you make it. That's kind of my mindset. So yeah, it's fun. I enjoy it.
I was definitely highly impressed with all of those various things that you had built and put together. And I think it opens up a lot of options for things that we can do in the future. I think most people, too, who have been involved in this research realize that, we're constantly trying to find existing products to put to use, but not all of them are necessarily made for what it is that we're trying to do. So the fact that you have this background and this talent and skill set to generate those things yourself is pretty impressive. And I know we're all grateful for it. Now, Mark, I also understand that you've authored some books related to the topic. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about that and where they might find those?
My wife, Sharon, was 35-year elementary art school teacher. When she retired in 2015, she decided she wanted to write and illustrate children's books. So one night we were sitting around after dinner, and I suggested we write children's books with a Bigfoot in it. And she kind of looked at me funny, like, well, I don't know if that would be a good idea. And so anyway, long story short, we ended up writing a series of field guides, children's field guides, which features a Bigfoot family of 4 Bigfoot, and they take the kids through the forest and introduce them to their forest friends. And currently we have a tree guide, a mammal guide, a bird guide, and a butterfly wildflower book that is available. Sharon did all the illustrations. They're really fun for kids. Kids seem to really enjoy reading them. And you can find those on the web at walkingwithbigfoot.com or on Amazon. We have the books on Amazon also. So the series is called Walking with Bigfoot, and we do have a children's activity book that we just came out with too that supplements that. So it's been fun. It's kind of a retirement activity, and it does allow us to get to some of these Bigfoot shows, which are interesting to attend and be vendors there.
Excellent. I think that goes a long way to facilitating the public outreach and education portion of this group's mission statement. And it's also, to your point, a good excuse for you and I to get together at some of these conferences that have occurred around the country where we've been able to spend some time together too. So hopefully a lot of listeners will go check those out, especially those who have young children who might be interested in the subject. So in closing, I know that we're wrapping up this particular summer operation. Very soon we'll be doing a members retreat where we're going to record another podcast episode that will be a recap of this particular year. But I'd like to ask you both, Bud, what would you like to see happen next year? Have you got any plans for next year's summer operations?
Well, I would actually like to see more cameras deployed in possibly a different array and see if we can capture one of these things. And that's what I'm looking forward to next year. I'm sure we'll be on a couple different teams throughout the summer.
And how about yourself, Mark? Any big plans for next year? Anything you'd like to see happen or that you've got germinating on the brain right now?
I do enjoy the thermal viewing at night. So I'm interested in using our thermals down there and seeing if we can capture. Like Bud, I've never seen an ape, but still very interested in a visual encounter. And hopefully we can get that done. But next year, I just hope to participate any way possible.
I'd like to thank both of you so very much, not only for being a part of this episode, but for everything that you bring to the table. I think the group is benefiting significantly from both of your talents and insights and skills. And so I hope to see that further into the future. And I can't wait to see you guys again in the field soon. I guess it will be at the retreat. So members will be hearing our conversations about Delta sometime in the beginning of next year. So thank you guys so very much for being here, and hope you both have an excellent day.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and you have a great day.
This next segment comprises Brian Brown, Brandon Lentz, and professional wildlife biologist Angelo Capparella having a discussion about citizen science and other things. This was recorded on-site in Area X while the three men were in the field together.
So we've been out here now for, it's been a week. You're no stranger to going out into the woods and looking for all manner of animals, are you? You've been all over the world looking for birds and such.
Well, not quite all over the world, but many, many countries in South America, from Mexico to Argentina and Chile. So looking for birds primarily, and we've been fortunate enough to discover some new species.
Oh, really? So where did that happen?
That happened in Peru, where we discovered a new species of small parrot, and also discovered a new species of barbet, and helped confirm a new species of flycatcher.
So when you go out and do that sort of work, when you're doing these are bird surveys that you're going on, or looking, are you looking for birds specifically when you go out? Are you looking for new birds, or are you trying to count up birds that you know are already there?
We are intentionally visiting areas of Western Amazonia for the Peruvian work. South America is often called the bird continent because the diversity is so incredible, and we still don't have an adequate handle on the extent of species, their ranges, etc. So much of this is kind of doing the kind of basic collecting that Audubon would have done in North America at the time. And so we're trying to get enough knowledge both so that we understand the bird's biology, but also can do effective conservation of these birds as well.
So when you go out on these expeditions, what are they like? How many people? How long do they last? That sort of thing. What are the sort of the logistics, and how do they look on the ground?
Well, they're certainly quite challenging. There's not many institutions that do it. While I was at Louisiana State University, I got training in how it is done. And basically, you have around 6 or 7 biologists. You have a couple of our chief guides that we've worked with for years. And then we hire local people wherever we go. And we basically work our way back to promising areas that no one has been to before in terms of biologists. And then we encamp for usually about 5 or 6 weeks. We create a network of trails on which we put mist nets. We traverse these trails with our shotguns. We do collecting of the whole body specimen. We also do multiple recordings. And we even carry liquid nitrogen back into these areas to do tissue samples, so that for genetic work. So it's pretty complicated logistically trying to do all of this, and part of my training as a grad student was to learn how to do that.
So a lot of people might wonder why we need to collect specimens of birds that we already know exist, that we already have specimens of. What's the value? What value do you see as a biologist to collecting specimens of known birds that we're already familiar with?
Even for known birds, there's a lot we don't know about their basic biology. For example, diet. When you collect a specimen, you actually get the stomach with the contents, and we save those as well in ethanol for later analysis. When you have the whole bird, there are things you can do with taking a sample of feather, or by just looking at the kind of variation from series that are all over the range of the bird. If you ever look at any papers on basic bird biology, you'll often see that bird specimens were part of that. In fact, if you look at the beginning of any of your bird field guides, you'll also find that the bird artists aren't out there trying to paint birds that are flitting around in the canopy, the ones that you have trouble identifying too. They actually look at the specimens and compare those also to the living bird, just as Audubon did. Audubon blended both. He would learn the living bird, but he also needed the specimen in order to really see the details of the plumage and be able to do accurate kinds of paintings, so that then those could be used by other people who want to do non-lethal studies.
What's the value of taking multiple specimens instead of just one?
It's really important because every specimen is really a data point, if you will. And there's a lot of variation. There's variation that's age and sex related in organisms. There's variation in space. As you move around the range of an organism, you may end up with different subspecies, or if not quite that dramatic, you can see that local adaptations can arise based on the ecology of the area. There's also a variation in time, evolution. And so there's even been seen in specimens collected 50 years apart, subtle shifts in the population, which reflects the fact that there may be changes in the environment in which they're adapting to, or in terms of the frequency of certain genes. And so one thing we've learned is that you never know, you can never anticipate what specimens can be used for in the future. Probably the classic case was the old egg collections that had been taken that included peregrine falcon was instrumental in proving that the use of DDT was causing eggshell thinning. If they had not had a time series of eggs, the industry, of course, was claiming they had nothing to do with what was happening, but it was perfectly correlated with the introduction of DDT in the environment, and so it led to the banning DDT and the recovery of a lot of our raptors. And I could go on and on with all the kinds of novel methods that we've learned. No one realized that we could actually extract DNA from bird specimens or anything else. Now they do it even from fossil organisms. And so you never know what a well-curated collection will be used for in the future.
And so we're talking about two different types of the type of specimen collection that the NAWAC has advocated for with regard to wood apes is to establish the animal, to describe the animal for the first time. The kind of collection you're talking about is much more about learning as much as you can about an animal, how it lives and how it's been involving in the environment. Those are really two different kinds of things, are they not?
Yes, I suppose so. But you think of it this way, though. Part of the reason to get a specimen of a wood ape is to definitively demonstrate its reality to science. But concurrent with that, collecting other aspects of wood ape biology like hair samples, blood, feces, vocalizations, the kind of basic data you're getting when you're out in the field, all of that will build up a complete natural history profile of the creature as well. And so archiving the kind of material is really critical as well in terms of coupling the specimen material that allow you to get at basic anatomy and morphology, things like that, as well as proving its existence. But that then you don't need to continue collecting vast series or anything to get other kinds of information that you can get from non-lethal sampling. Non-lethal sampling such as finding hair samples that you now know can be definitively linked. The key, though, in being able to do this additional work is you first got to have that basic specimen to know how to link it up to the other kinds of smaller specimens, if you will, in terms of feces, blood, and hair and vocalizations. And until you can match all of that up, you really don't know exactly what you're working with for sure.
So folks like Todd Disotell, he's asserted that an animal could be listed, it could be proven to exist solely from DNA analysis through blood or something like that. But I know we've had conversations about this. It's not quite so simple, you don't think?
Technically, you certainly could define a new species based purely on DNA, but in practice, it's really frowned upon because you really need to have the whole organism. DNA is only a part of an organism, and even if you knew what the genes actually coded for, you still wouldn't be able to know the whole organism, especially when you're dealing with so-called higher organisms where learned behavior is a big factor. So the genes are an important part of the picture, but they're not by any means, any stretch of imagination, all of the picture. And anyone who has studied birds or mammals or anything else knows that if you just had the gene sequence, you would still be missing a lot in terms of understanding the natural history, ecology, ethology, all of that kind of stuff. However, my own personal view is that the DNA evidence has kind of gotten so muddled. The attempts to report on sampling of potential specimen material that has yielded DNA has led to so much wide interpretation that I think we're going to have to get a DNA sample that's actually from a partial or whole body specimen before you actually know you've linked the two together. And even after that, it turns out that analyzing DNA is more than just doing a straight sequence. Right. It's a lot more complicated. In fact, if you look at the history of trying to figure out the relationships between human chimps and gorillas, using molecular data, it took a decade to work out the proper statistical methods, the proper parts of the genome to work with, et cetera. And so we really do need to have a solid specimen material, and I'm talking about whole or key partial body, along with the DNA. Otherwise, we're going to be struggling. I used to think DNA itself might be enough, But again, I've been somewhat critical of some of the DNA approaches that have been taken, particularly in terms of the interpretation, sometimes going to the wild end or not doing proper pre-screening of material. That at this point here, I don't think the scientific community is ever going to believe any DNA sequence in and of itself.
There were, for many years, people thought in this community that DNA was sort of like the silver bullet. If we could just collect DNA, if we could just get some blood or some hair or something, then that would be it. We've proven the animal exists. But you're thinking at this point that the waters have been so muddied that perhaps that's just not going to work.
Right. I was of the same opinion that if we could just get a very good quality DNA sample where we could get major parts of the genome sequence, that would be enough. But yes, I agree. The waters have been so sullied, and the level of proof for something like this, it'd be one thing if I said I had a new species of flycatcher or sparrow based on DNA. There's a pretty small community that would really get upset about that. Right. It's another claiming that there's a North American great ape or whatever this turns out to be. And so the standard of proof is going to need to be a lot higher. And so at this point, while I think it's great to be going after samples that could have DNA, because those samples can also be used in other things, such as stable isotope analysis with hair and the likes. There's still things we'll learn about the organism, but in terms of that key first question, definitively proving first that it exists, and second, trying to fit it into our understanding of the primate group, at this point, it's going to take either a whole specimen or a significant part of a specimen. Even then, I think you're going to have some pushback initially. And so you want to make sure that you've really thought it through how you're going to collect the specimen, store it, and then involve the scientific community. Otherwise, we could have other fiascos develop in terms of the specimen material.
So what do you mean by that? What sort of pushback, if you brought in significant portion, as you say, hands or some sort of identifiable body part, not just a piece of it, up to and including an entire body, what kind of pushback would you get? At that point, have you not presented something that is wholly unique? How could they push back on that, do you think?
Well, I think in a couple of ways. One might be that, first off, if the specimen isn't properly provenanced and then curated, then, people could potentially construct all sorts of scenarios as to what was going on. I think eventually that would fall apart as long as whatever is remaining of the specimen is in reasonably good shape. But there have been some controversies. The great Argus pheasant, is it really a species known only from a single feather? Things like that. So that was not enough to really put to rest some of these kinds of discussions. I think the ramifications, the paradigm shift, the mental challenge, in a sense, it will make to all of us in terms of thinking about a great ape other than ourselves roaming the North American continent, means that this is going to have a huge psychological impact on a lot of factors, everything from the scientific community, which had been such a naysayer over all of these years, except for some of those brave souls of scientists who have lent themselves to trying to encourage research. Is going to really, I think, show the merit of the citizen scientist model that is really continuing the fight to really demonstrate its existence. It's going to have huge conservation and economic impacts in terms of interpreting exactly what are we dealing with. Is this a threatened and endangered species, either in part or all of its range? What does this mean about how we will now interact with the woods? I think it's kind of mind-blowing to think about what final definitive proof is going to indicate. And again, scientifically, the thing I most want to know is, where does this fit into the clade, into the evolutionary tree of great apes? I think that's going to be really mind-blowing as well, because there's still a lot of gaps in understanding the pathways by which we got to all of the great apes, including humans. And I think this is going to be really, really fascinating.
We were talking just the other day about what would happen when the species is established, we'll go from having, a couple of dozen at any given point across the country, citizen naturalists going out into the woods looking for them, to suddenly thousands of dedicated individuals in the field all the time. That's just mind-blowing.
You had mentioned that the animal has to be properly curated in order for it to be established. Can you explain the steps that should be taken from getting the animal out of the woods and into the proper hands?
Right. If we're certainly talking about the whole animal or a significant portion, such as a hand, a foot, or a head, then first and foremost, you want to try to get it into a preservation state as soon as possible. Getting it into a large freezer initially, ideally, if you can get it into a -80 freezer, that would be fantastic. And then that will buy you the time you need to reach out to qualified scientists through the networks that you've already established through very reputable people to bring in a team. In a way, it'd be sort of like what happened when they discovered these hominin remains in South Africa in that cave. Basically, they realized they had these remains, but they didn't want to collect them until they had their methodological protocols intact. And then they invited a team of specialists. And then when they published their results, you had this magnificent series of papers dealing with all aspects of what they could extract from the specimen haul that they took out in a very methodical and careful way. And so you want to kind of think ahead as what would you do once you have this. And it's great that this organization has done that, thinking ahead, because we may only get one really good shot at it, pardon the pun, in order to indicate that this thing exists. And then you're really going to have to carefully manage how the scientific community gets engaged so that there's no questions raised in terms of any inappropriate handling of the material that could in any way particularly cause people to start questioning what's going on.
This is not the first time you've been in the woods looking for giant hairy bipeds in North America. How did you get involved in just sort of an interest in cryptozoology in general? And then I want to talk more about specifically some of the expedition work that you've done in this area. But what brought you to this field of animals that aren't supposed to be there?
I've always been interested in zoology, even as a 5-year-old. And as I was a teenager, got very interested in cryptozoology after reading Bernard Heuvelmann's On the Track of Unknown Animals. I love the way he introduces that book. The great days of zoology are not gone. And what he's talking about is that there's still a lot of organisms remaining to be discovered, and not just small soil microarthropods or whatever, although that's important, but actually significant species have yet to be discovered, and particularly the bird and mammals to be found, as well as reptiles and fish and the like. And that some of these might be only of significance as specialists, but many of them can be of quite intriguing nature. I mean, everybody remembers the coelacanth of 1938. That really got attention across the world when this living fossil was rediscovered alive. And so Heuvelmann's book kind of got me into the field. Ivan Sanderson's book, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, and then reading John Green's masterful series of works. And then just taking it off from there got me very interested in cryptozoology and the Sasquatch phenomenon as a whole. And then over time, as I matured as a zoologist and sort of kept up with what I could, when the International Society of Cryptozoology was established and Richard Greenwell was instrumental in doing that, I was one of the first members of that when I heard about it, and subsequently got involved with the society, having met Richard, got involved peer reviewing papers and also later on the board. But during that time, I learn more about what Richard Greenwell and his son Darwin were doing to try to first select an area that could be worked. And they selected an area in Northern California in the Six Rivers National Forest, a wilderness area there in the Siskiyou Mountains. He did a very thorough job to try to find a place that could be worked. And he also had a philosophy of how to work it that I really liked because it had been effective in our discovery of new bird species. You find a place that you think is likely to support a reasonable population of these creatures, and you go and work it for some depth. You don't just wander in and out. You recognize that, in essence, you've got to attract this organism to you because you're just not going, the odds of stumbling on it is really remote. Patterson and Gimlin were incredibly fortunate, but they really had put in their time trying to find it, and they were prepared when they did. But to actually get the kind of information you want, you really had to approach it the way we'd been approaching finding new species of birds in Amazonia. All of these bird species, we really had to become part of the forest for a while so that initially the first week, things have already gotten scared of you. But then over time, if you're not too threatening seeming, they become used to you. And so that really appealed to me. And then when I read his first field report for what they had accomplished in that area in the 9As, I said, Richard, I'd like to be a part of this. And that's how it happened.
So then you went on 3 expeditions. What were those like?
Those are quite exciting, actually, in terms of seeing how difficult it was to really get back into the Siskiyou Wilderness area. One of the expeditions was to Bluff Creek, but the other 2 were to this site that he had chosen. It was those 2 that were quite fascinating. And it was fun because we basically were just brainstorming, what kind of equipment would be useful on a extremely limited budget, what kind of approaches would be useful, how would we engage with the creature if we should be able to get it there? And so it involved a lot of just thinking and experimenting and sometimes doing somewhat crazy things like playing a Tibetan bowl and stuff like that. I mean, we just didn't know what would work. Right. But trying to, within the extent that we could, get some evidence. The hope was that if we could get some evidence, and at that time we were really particularly hopeful to get some video evidence, we thought that if we could, that maybe that would leverage future funding, that we could do more than that in terms of maybe even, who knows, actually tranquilizing one. We didn't really talk about collecting one at that time because we were still in the mindset that a good DNA sample would be sufficient. I later came to change my mind on that and thinking only a specimen will do, a whole body or significant partial body specimen. It's mandatory if your objective is to scientifically prove this thing. But it was really great. Richard was a font of incredible information and had an unbelievable memory of everything he'd read. He had talked to many people. He really kind of brought me into the field. I was a little reticent as a scientist just from the sense of not knowing who to ally with, who were reputable people. And he really helped guide me with that, who to stay away from, who to work with. And that was very valuable as I continued getting more and more involved into the research end of things.
What sort of factors made you decide to camp in this particular spot deep in the wilderness?
Well, Richard really was the one who he was trying to find a good area that was close to areas where Bigfoot sightings, Sasquatch sightings had been, but he also was researching the biology. He realized that apparently this had one of the highest bear densities in the whole Pacific Northwest, and a lot of people think that Sasquatches are ecologically very tied or close to bears in terms of similar food resources. They may use them at different times of the day or whatnot. He really looked into the entire Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion is one of the most biodiverse in the entire North America. Many people may not realize that, but it's incredibly biodiverse. He also researched, what is an area that you could actually get into using, in our case, horses and mules, where we could deploy things without getting too disturbed by other people, but also made sense getting into without getting too logistically difficult. And so he really had thought this all through and worked it out. And because they had such success on that first expedition, although on that first expedition they learned certain things such as how much food you really should have brought and how difficult it really was to work that habitat, and how some of the equipment they had really wasn't up to the environmental conditions. But they learned from each expedition, tried new things, and eventually in 2005, I felt we had really hit our stride. But unfortunately, the kind of information we gathered through our work there has yet to see the light of day for a whole host of reasons I won't get into, but that I hope will eventually see the light of day. Although at this point, I think that working the kind of site where we are here in the Ouachitas is logistically still challenging, but is a better way to go, especially based on the portfolio of information that NAWAC has generated. Really, really important.
Richard is no longer with us. So was that 2005 expedition, was that his last trip into the wilderness?
Yes, unfortunately, his cancer had resurfaced. We didn't fully know that because he didn't tell us. This was in some ways his last expedition out there. He actually passed away a couple of months later. A huge loss to cryptozoology in general, huge loss to his family, and a huge loss to his friends such as myself. So it kind of, for me personally, kind of stopped any further exploits in the field just because I really didn't know who to kind of link up with. I wanted to kind of bring whatever I could to kind of help, any help I could provide to citizen scientist groups that were doing things. I thought maybe some of the work I'd done as a field biologist in remote areas in South America and birds, maybe I would bring in some perspectives that might be useful. So I'd been kind of sounding out over the years different groups to see if there's any way in which I could help play a role, because I really want to see this thing confirmed and enter into the realm of science.
You found us. We didn't find you. How did you stumble upon the North American Wood Ape Conservancy?
I was trying to get kind of back into the field a bit after sort of mourning the loss of Richard and not really knowing were there any other scientists or groups or anybody out there who was doing the kind of work that I thought could yield actual results where I could potentially play a role. So I was sort of, looking out there. And then I happened to hear about Beachfoot 14, and heard that some key people like John Bindernagel likely be at these gatherings. And I thought, well, I've always wanted to go to Oregon anyway. There are a lot of birds I haven't seen there. And I thought that this would be a nice way to combine me maybe meeting some of the folks who were getting out at Beachfoot. So that was great in 2014. Then I had the invitation to go in 2015. And ironically, just before I went, I don't know how, just through some random Googling or something, I ran across NAWAC's monograph. It's kind of summarizing their results to date. And as I read it, I first loved the layout. It was set as a scientific document. It starts off with abstract and background information, why it makes sense to think that there could be wood apes as a preferred name for the population here at this area, trying to set up the scenario that this would be a good place to work and has proven itself to be. The philosophy of continually working the same area, being very both skeptical but not dismissive of evidence, and building up a case so that eventually you start learning more and more about the organism, leading up to the potential for actually getting the kind of evidence you need. And they're straight out up front saying we need a specimen. We needed a group that was willing to put in the time and perseverance to get a specimen ultimately. And it also looked to me like it was a furtherance of some of the work that Richard had started in the Siskiyous in the late 90s and up to the point of his death in 2005. And so I read that and was really wowed by that. And I heard that Bob and Kathy Strain were going to be giving a presentation at Beachfoot 15. So I knew that would be a good time if I went there again, part vacation and part attending the conference with my wife, that this might be really kind of cool. Again, reading that monograph, meeting Bob and Kathy, they were real down-to-earth, good people to talk with. I also had stumbled across Kathy's book on her anthropological research with the phenomenon. And then I reached out to Alton Higgins. Turned out we had some similar background, mutual friends. We just connected on so many levels. And then he was very forthcoming with inviting me to come to the annual meeting. And I got to meet some of the other great people there. When I realized that you had retired wildlife biologists involved and just learn more in depth as to how you were approaching it, I thought, well, boy, this is the group for me. And I wanted to contribute whatever I could to help with what was already an incredible operation that was moving forward. And so that's led to me now being interviewed here in the middle of the Wachitas.
It's fascinating to me listening when you spoke to our annual retreat and just having the week here with you this week. The work you were doing with Richard, there were so many parallels, not just in the way that you were approaching the work, but also sort of the logical stops you were making along the way. And it seems like the group that we're all part of was sort of like going along that same path and having some of the same thoughts. They may not have lined up perfectly, but we all sort of ended up in the same spot eventually. Do you think that Richard would have ended up there as well, or do you think that he would have taken a different path? I mean, it's probably impossible for you to say, but do you feel that evolution of thought would have continued with him?
I think that's very likely. Certainly, as you say, it was remarkable. I know he would have been very impressed with the extreme dedication, the care, the methodical, persevering way in which the group was doing its work, its concentration on the area to really get to learn the area so that you could work effectively within it. the way you comported yourself, and just everything about you. I think he would have really loved that. As to whether he would like to see an actual shooting with a specimen, I can't really say. We never really discussed that because we were still in the mindset at that time of thinking that a DNA sample would be sufficient, and at least in terms of definitively proving the existence of the organism. And then we thought the next step would actually be, after having a DNA sample from hair or some high quality, would be actually capturing a live individual, maybe doing primatological studies like Jane Goodall had done, or some of the others, people who have worked with primates. We kind of thought we would go from DNA proving it, and then to the living animal being studied both in life as well as maybe even captured in some way. So we never really got to the point as to when are we, in its essence, going to be forced to kill one in order to get this field to the point of maturity where the whole scientific community recognizes it exists, and we can continue the road to both going back and mining the old data that has been carefully assembled, which will be incredibly valuable at that point to the entire scientific community, but also move forward in understanding more about. I mean, there's so many questions that'll have to be answered after that. Personally, one of the things that most fascinates me is I was also originally, while I was coming along saying that, I was nearing 100% certainty that there really was an unknown creature behind these sightings and the evidence that had been forthcoming, I was very, very hesitant to think that they existed outside the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. And yet I was struggling, as I'd had many discussions with Richard, well, is there something about the body of evidence outside the Pacific Northwest that is demonstrably different from that in the Pacific Northwest? Because if there isn't, then either you have to think all of the evidence is not very compelling, or that this is indicative of an organism that lives across a lot of areas of North America. And so I was wrestling with all of that and starting to think, well, there may be these foci of other places where the amount of habitat exists that could support a breeding sustainable population, et cetera. And so, again, reading the monograph made me realize that, wow, this might be another place that could really have a self-sustaining population of these creatures. And I think the evidence has gotten me to the point, particularly after my being here, that, yeah, this is a place to work. This is really a place that's deserving of the kind of focused impact. And I think that if you actually get a specimen here, in a way, that would be better than getting one in the Pacific Northwest, because in a shot, it would indicate that this is a more wide-ranging species than we thought, assuming it is the same species, which I think is the most parsimonious explanation. And therefore, there is justification for thinking that this may be a more widely distributed, self-sustaining organism occupying multiple habitat areas, which in a way is even more mind-blowing than just thinking that there is a relictual population of North American great ape in just the Pacific Northwest. So the mind just starts being blown in terms of all the ramifications of the work that you're doing here, over and above, hopefully getting to a specimen, what it means in general for the phenomenon as a whole.
So we've walked miles and miles throughout these mountains over the past week. Do you have any reason to believe that this area couldn't sustain an animal like this?
No, not at all. Just driving down here for the first time to really see the area. Alton Higgins gave me a great tour, getting to know more about the nature of the evidence you've been assembling, seeing the habitat. Yeah, I mean, the more I see it, the more I see certain really nice parallels with the Siskiyous in terms of low density of people. People tend to not really go into the wilderness and spend long periods of time. They tend to stay with their noisy equipment and everything in just easily accessible areas. There's plenty of places for a population to roam and stay out of direct conflict with humans, but yet still be studyable through the methods that you're producing. So yeah, the more I see the area in the field, as well as just looking through all the maps and learning more about the incredible endemism in this area, endemic herps, endemic organisms of all types. I mean, this area is rich biologically, and really hasn't been as well worked biologically as you might think for something that is not in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of people just don't realize that there's still so much to learn about literally our own backyard here in North America. And while probably the new bird species to be discovered will primarily be in places like South America and the Congo and Southeast Asia, there's still a lot to be learned about biodiversity, even large organisms here in North America. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. We're sitting in mountains that most people, even who live in the state, might not even know exist. There was a term you used the other day that I had not heard before, admittedly, that was sort of describing all of the sort of indicators that are all pointing in one direction. Can you talk a little bit about that concept?
There's a term called consilience. That's a really neat term to think about. E.O. Wilson, the great naturalist and biologist, wrote a book entitled Consilience, and he talked about how in most kinds of work, as you're trying to understand a particular phenomenon, one way to think about getting to the heart of the matter in a scientific sense is starting to look at how different approaches towards evidence starts pointing to the same conclusion. You reach a consilience where various lines of evidence take you to that nexus point. And thinking about using that thought process of consilience to get to the inner truth of a particular phenomenon is a kind of a nice way, I think, of thinking of a lot of cryptozoological phenomena. You start looking at what do the Native Americans know about this, what have their folklore and knowledge of the area talked about. You bring in understanding of the ecology of the entire area in terms of thinking about could it actually support whatever cryptid you're talking about. Just following the lines of evidence from different viewpoints and seeing if it all sort of makes sense and points towards something being real. Looking at the biogeographic and historical biogeographic knowledge of a particular area. Giving the history of the Ouachita orogeny, the building of the mountains and how it fits in the overall history of North American development of the topography of North America and its flora and fauna, pulling it all together and seeing if it points in a consistent way towards a single explanation. That's consilience, and I think we're reaching consilience towards another number of cryptozoological phenomena, including the North America's great ape, to use John Bindernagel's term.
So do you think a reasonable person would look at the body of evidence around the great ape here in North America and come to the conclusion that there may be something there? Obviously, you can't use this all by itself to establish and prove that it's there, but would a reasonable person, a reasonable scientist look at the evidence and conclude that there could very well be something there?
I think so, and that certainly led me to the point of being interested enough to commit time and resources to the furthering of the understanding of the phenomenon. Yes, I think at this point, it's unreasonable to not accept that there's a reality out there. We obviously don't know its precise identity, etc. But as John Bindernagel developed in his second book, which I really urge people to read, science is no longer, or scientists are no longer acting in a scientifically responsible way. They've moved from skepticism to dismissiveness. They actually haven't even weighed the evidence because they don't think there's any credible evidence to weigh, because there can't be a phenomenon to be explained that could be a new creature unknown to science. So, yeah, I think at this point, much of the scientific community is being unreasonable in terms of dismissing and not helping further an approach to try to really get at the heart of this matter.
It's frustrating. We talked about this the other night, but what's frustrating to me about it is if they would just crack open their minds a tiny bit, there's so many things that, well, for example, you're a biologist. You're very much concerned about environment and habitat for all kinds of animals. When I've spoken to David Mijewski from the National Wildlife Federation, they talk about these sort of like headline animals. That's not the term he used, but these big guys you put on stamps, that protect large, there's reasons for these guys to invest even a little bit of thought or attention to the subject, but they just write it off. They don't even see any of that at all. Why do you think that is? That's a big question, but I'm just asking.
Yeah, it's a complicated question in that people who don't know the reality of work in academia, the kinds of pressures that scientists face within their own community, the kinds of retaliation, I guess is not too strong a word, that your career can suffer if you get involved as a scientist. I've had people ask, if the thought that there's a undiscovered great ape species in North America, you'd think every zoologist, every primatologist would be rushing out to try to study it. Well, in terms of career-based ornithologists have to earn a living and support a family, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And to their credit, some have tried to do it in a bold way and have suffered some of the consequences of that. And so we really have gotten to where we are dependent on citizen scientists really taking on the science. The nice thing about science is anyone can do it. And you don't have to be a PhD trained scientist in order to work your way through it. In fact, if you look at the way science developed, it was really often either wealthy individuals who had the time and money to do it, or even people like Audubon, who was living hand to mouth, who would basically do science. Science anyone can do. And there are fields of science such as ornithology and astronomy where the citizen scientist is contributing hugely to the field. Mm-hmm. And I like to see personally in cryptozoology an alliance between the citizen scientists and the scientists, just because the one thing scientists can do is kind of help you couch the evidence and enter into this, if you want it to be scientifically demonstrable, kind of help we learn the career and how to kind of help the citizen scientists present their data in formats that will be acceptable to scientists. Maybe even in terms of methods that for proper curation of material and the like can help with that. I think an alliance between the two groups is, in a broad sense, is the way to go. I'm very used to that because in ornithology, we're very used to working with passionate individuals who may not have the degree, but have taught themselves and interacted with scientists not only how to do science, but how to do ornithological research. There's a huge history of that in ornithology, probably more so than in some other disciplines. And so we're very comfortable as ornithologists working with others to accomplish these kinds of goals. Okay. I really subscribe to John Bindernagel's philosophy that it's going to take a while for science to catch up with what everyone in the field is doing. But that doesn't mean we can't be doing it now, because all of that data, if properly gathered and curated and maintained and made available, people are going to flock to that once you actually have the specimen. So to me, I see you on two parallel tracks. One is to actually get a specimen so that you can bring it in the realm of science, figure out where it fits in our evolutionary tree. But then the real work begins in terms of fully understanding the natural history of the organisms in both the local and the regional context, because we know that this population, to be self-sustaining, has to have complex interactions among individuals. Then you want to know, how does it interconnect with others? Because presumably you do have dispersing individuals that will be flowing genes to other populations. Where are those centers? Mm-hmm. I mean, the field is wide open. There's going to be a lot to do. I know some people fear that, the excitement will be gone once you have your first specimen. I think the excitement will just begin, because there's so much basic information to be gathered, some of which will now be able to put into some context thanks to the dedication of many in these and other groups. But also it'll open the door to finally getting the kind of marshaling the actual resources we need to take advantage of all the technological breakthroughs that, let's face it, are expensive, and that can be deployed at a scale and at a level that is just going to be going on and on. I mean, I want to see books coming out about all aspects of the North American great apes ecology, its behavior, its conservation, everything. I mean, it's just going to be exciting once that's done. And getting that specimen will be the linchpin for really moving that further. But the data you're getting in parallel now, which will enable you not only to get that specimen, but also to put it into context ecologically and in a natural history sense, is really key. And I know how much you love this region and love these mountains and would like to see them managed in a proper way. This will be a fantastic leverage point to do that.
You say that the real work begins after the specimen, after the establishment of the animal. And I think in a lot of ways that's true, because they're so incredibly furtive. They're so incredibly difficult to observe. So I think two things. I think, first of all, and I think that we don't really appreciate how hard it's going to be to try to study a real animal that's already been established versus this sort of mythological unicorn type thing that we're dealing with today, because that's what most people are thinking. But also, it seems to me that trying to at least begin the groundwork for some of the methodology you would use to be able to collect these data about them seems to be critically important, because if you're a primate expert in orangutans or gorillas, there's no way to know what percentage of your sort of experience is going to be applicable here. Do you think that's true?
Oh, very much, definitely. And there'll continue to be a huge role for citizen scientists. Again, I always think back to my bird experiences. If you look at all the citizen scientists that help with trying to survey marbled murrelets or northern spotted owls, if you look at citizen scientists who've been involved in this ongoing mystery of the ivory-billed woodpecker, you'll just see the role will just expand. So no one should feel let down, as I think might inevitably some might when the first specimen is captured. I say that's going to open the door for all sorts of people, because you're going to need an army of researchers, an army of people, and there just aren't enough PhD-type scientists that will even be able to do it. So the opportunities for citizen science to be an incredible research arm of the scientific community is huge, and of the conservation community as well. It just in the same way as our thought, where we still debated whether we rediscovered the ivory bill in the Cache River Basin of Arkansas, it leveraged so much conservation money to start doing the things we needed to do to protect and restore the great southern swamplands that so many people love. All of this will come forth. I think it'll be a golden age of research on North America's great ape. That trigger point is going to be getting the specimen, but I don't want you to see that as your sole objective. And obviously, you don't see that as your sole objective.
Well, I want to thank you for two things, Angelo. I want to thank you for sitting down with Brandon and I and having this conversation, but I also want to thank you for doing that Google search or whatever it is that led you to the monograph, because I cannot describe to you how great it is to have you here, to have your expertise here, to have your insight here. The entire group is just thrilled to have you a part of this work. So thank you so much for coming out, and thank you so much for having this conversation with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I feel honored to play a small role, and hopefully an evolving role, in all that you're doing. I just admire the dedication, the commitment. It's really remarkable, and really puts a lot of professional scientists to shame to not be doing what you all are doing. But you're doing it, and you're doing science. So don't feel discouraged because of what other scientists do. Think about science itself, and think about the organism, and that you want to protect it. You want to understand it. Think about that if you ever get discouraged about what individual scientists are doing in a dismissive way.
Those howls you just heard were obtained in Area X in September of 2018. I was there at the time and heard them from close range. They immediately struck me as too deep of a call for a coyote to produce. Coyotes yip and howl at a much higher pitch than the animal heard in the recording. To me, they sounded more like wolves. To get further clarification, and possibly an answer to the mystery, I sent the audio file around to a few different wolf biologists around the continent. The responses I received were surprising. The howls were shown to be well within the vocal range of red wolves. What's special about that, and potentially a huge discovery, is red wolves haven't been seen in the Ouachita Mountains since 1944. That is a 74-year gap between the recording and when they were thought to have disappeared from the area completely. The remaining population of wild red wolves is believed to be somewhere around 20 to 30 animals, all of them in North Carolina. Since I heard those howls a year ago, I've taken a special interest in red wolves. To find them still persisting in the wild without human assistance would be quite remarkable. I've written an article about this potential discovery, showing how the vocal range of our recording compares to other canids. The results are quite compelling. The article can be found at our website at woodape.org. Joining me now for further analysis is the Executive Director of the Red Wolf Coalition, Kim Wheeler. Kim, I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to speak with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I appreciate you wanting to talk about the red wolf.
Before we dive into that audio file, I would like to learn a little bit more about your background and the path that you took that led to you being a leading voice for red wolf conservation. What led to your initial interest in red wolves?
I, in 5th grade, had a teacher that we were just supposed to spend one semester talking about Native Americans, and the classroom, we were so enthralled with everything we were learning that she extended it to an entire year. And you can't learn about Native American culture without realizing that animals are a huge part of their customs and their culture. And the wolf and the bear stood out for me. So that sort of piqued my interest in wolves, and always was interested in wolves. And my background is actually a sales and marketing degree, and that's what I did up until 2005, and that's when I came to work with the Red Wolf Coalition. I actually did some volunteer work at the International Wolf Center in Ely, Minnesota, and had one of those aha moments, like the universe was telling me, you need to be doing something with wolves. I know that sounds a little far-fetched and out there, but that was my moment. I came back to North Carolina and learned about the red wolf, had no idea we even had red wolves. And I started volunteering with the Red Wolf Coalition. Then I was on the board, and then the board asked me if I would consider taking the executive director position. And I commuted back and forth from Raleigh till my daughter graduated from high school, and then moved here permanently. Have been in this job for 14 years. So in my 14 years, I've seen the ebbs and flows of what a conservation program looks like, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Challenging days. Some days you want to lay the keys on the desk and find somebody younger. But most days that feeling passes, and I look every day to try to do something to help the red wolf, be it through our social media, through interviews like this, talking with students. No matter what, just having that opportunity to tell the red wolf story is really, really important.
So you obviously have quite the passion for conservation then.
I do. I think one of my goals when I speak to people or I do an interview is not necessarily to make them love wolves, but I want them to understand the red wolf is an amazing story of conservation. And there are a lot of animals out there that have amazing stories. And I hope that I can bring out those feelings in people of wanting to help or be part of something bigger, whatever that is. You know, if your passion is snakes or turtles or fish or butterflies, I hope when you walk away from a presentation of mine, you'll find that you learned a lot about the red wolf, but that maybe you step back and go, you know what, there are things that I can do, and let me go and find out how I can help.
So without going into your absolutely full presentation, can you give me sort of a synopsis about the red wolves and their history leading up to now?
The red wolf is an endangered species. It was first reintroduced back into North Carolina in 1987. We started with 8 wolves. Prior to that, the red wolf was an eastern canid. The remaining population was found between Texas and Louisiana. There were about 17 animals that they determined were red wolves based on morphological data, which is head size, ear size, body size. This was really before genetic testing, so we did not have that sort of information at the beginning. Those wolves were pulled out of the wild and went to Point Defiant Zoo in Tacoma, Washington. And from there, the population got healthy. And then the Fish and Wildlife started thinking about a reintroduction program. And when you look at the Southeast, there seems like there's a lot of places to reintroduce wolves, but there really is not. And certainly now, with the prevalence of coyotes on the landscape all the way across our United States. We did not have that challenge back in 1987, but by 1999, they definitely were beginning to see an influx of coyotes here in North Carolina and into the red wolf recovery area. So the red wolf is a story of resilience, not just for the animals themselves, but for the field staff that took on that challenge to reintroduce a top predator. A canid had never been reintroduced before, and they were looking at using captive stock. And so then that bears the question is, will these animals that come out of captivity know how to act in the wild and find their own food and sort of become wild again? So there was certainly a process they went through to pick good candidates for release. And as I mentioned, they did that in 1987, and paws hit the ground. And, here we are 30 some years later. Some of those original wolves made it the first year, some did not, but the second year, the first group of puppies were born, and so was the Red Wolf Recovery Program in North Carolina.
So leading up to today, how healthy is the red wolf population?
So the animals themselves are healthy. The problem is in the last, probably since 2012, the population has been in decline. In 2012, we lost 10% of the population due to gunshot mortality. As I mentioned, we have coyotes here on the Albemarle Peninsula and in the recovery area. And it is difficult to tell the difference between a red wolf and a coyote. A red wolf that's born in the spring is about the size of a coyote during hunting season, which runs October through December. So we recognize that it can be difficult to tell the difference, but we also know that some of those deaths were intentional in the manner in which the wolf was found. Some wolves, a carcass is over here and a tracking collar that they normally would wear around their neck is in a different location. Certainly that in 2012 began to add to the decline of the population. In 2005, when I came on, the population was at its height at about 130, and we currently have fewer than 15 wolves on the landscape. There have been a lot of challenges with local landowners here that we never really encountered some of those issues in the history of the program. But I would say the last 5 years, there's local landowners have been very vocal about not wanting wolves on their property. So today, I feel like the program is almost at its beginning again. The Fish and Wildlife, as the responsible party, is going to have to figure out a way to work with landowners to figure out what it will take for landowners to allow wolves on their property. And it's going to be hard work, but more than anything, the Fish and Wildlife has been doing this for 30 plus years. They know what to do. They really have the advantage of knowing all the things that worked and all the things that didn't work, and look at those things that didn't work and be able to step back and say, how can we change this? How do we make this better? Or we really shouldn't try that ever again. So even though the program is in decline, and it does give us all pause for grave concern, I do believe that the Fish and Wildlife knows what to do.
I live in Minnesota, and I spend a lot of time hunting in northern Minnesota, where gray wolves have proliferated over the past 10, 15 years thanks to a protection status by the Fish and Wildlife. And it's very controversial here as well, especially with landowners, as you say,
Sure.
and with hunters especially. So you and I connected after I sent the audio file of those howls that we recorded in 2018. And
Yeah.
I sent them around to different red wolf experts such as yourself. And luckily, you were kind enough to give a stranger like me a chance, and you listened to the file yourself. You said that the howls did sound like red wolf howls that you have heard before, but you can not identify a wolf based on its howl alone.
So coyotes kind of have a yippee howl to them. And so these did not have that. They had more of a wolf sounding howl. So what they are, I don't know. That's genetic testing to be able to determine that.
But you actually have experience in being in close quarters with red wolves, and you've heard their howls in person, correct?
I have. We did the howlings at Alligator River for 5 years, and I've been the caretaker of red wolves here locally since 2012.
What's unique about the ones that we were talking about is that they were recorded in deep southeast Oklahoma, where gray wolves definitely do not range. And the last time red wolves were found in that area, which is in the Ouachita Mountain ecoregion, was in 1944. That would mean that there is an 80-year span in between when they were last found and when these files were recorded. And if those are indeed red wolves, which I think they very well might be, I think that's pretty incredible.
It is. And so right now the Fish and Wildlife is undertaking a research project looking at red wolves in southeast Louisiana because there are some very interesting looking canids. So what can actually happen is it could be that in these animals, there could be some red wolf ancestry in these animals that you recorded. Given that there could be some red wolf history in them, then these red wolf genes, as animals reproduce, are reproducing. And so that could certainly be affecting their howl. If they are a hybrid, say a coyote bred with something that howls different than a coyote, it could be that too. So it's really kind of an unknown. That's what I always find interesting about pictures and audio files that I get. Sometimes I can tell right off the bat, and then other times it sounds very interesting. There's a lot going on in Texas and Louisiana right now with a lot of big canids. I'm hoping that the Fish and Wildlife will also want to do some research at the animals on Galveston Island in Texas. It would be pretty amazing to think that some red wolf genes have survived all these years, either in Oklahoma or Texas or Louisiana.
If there are indeed remaining red wolves in Oklahoma, what can we do to further our knowledge about them and possibly obtain more evidence?
The leader on that would be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, you would connect with them, and then they would request, number one, genetic material, whether that's scat or fur, something that has genetic material from those animals. And then that would go to the Fish and Wildlife, and then they would send that to a genetics lab to have it tested. Certainly documenting via pictures are great. I don't think audio files would get them interested, but certainly some pictures of these canids. That was some of the first things that I saw coming out of Texas, were some pictures of some really big canids that had red wolf ears, body size, muzzle. They were not just coyotes that were bigger than average. There was definitely something very wolf-like about them. And then one individual happened to find an animal that was deceased, so he was able to get some genetic material, and that sort of started the process on that. And I'm not sure what they've done in Louisiana. I know they've gotten some genetic material. So at that point, you kind of have to step back and let science do the work. It's a slow process.
There are a handful of examples of mammals that have previously thought to have gone extinct, only to be rediscovered decades later. And I'm sincerely hoping now that the red wolf, at least west of North Carolina, is also going to fall under that category. Because after I've heard these howls and I've started to dive into it a little more and learn more about the red wolf and their population at the moment and the conservation of them, I've taken a vested interest. So I'm certainly going to keep going back to that area where those howls were recorded and try to obtain more evidence.
The red wolf story is just fascinating to me. I mean, there's so many aspects of it. There have been challenges, and the Fish and Wildlife has been able to step back and come back with solutions. That's why I said they know how to do this. So when these wolves were first reintroduced, we didn't have any idea that hybridization with coyotes would become a problem. And so then, the late 1990s, all of a sudden they find that red wolves and coyotes are breeding, and that's what a hybrid event is. And so they brought some scientists together, came up with this adaptive management plan, which in its basic form calls for the sterilization of coyotes. So that's one way to help stabilize a population. And because coyotes, like wolves, will defend their territory, they will kick out any transient animals. So it really encompasses a lot of positives that are needed. And so we're hoping here in the near future that adaptive management is something that the Fish and Wildlife will resume.
Where can people go if they want to find more information about the Red Wolf Coalition, Kim?
redwolves.com. We also have a pretty active Facebook page, Red Wolf Coalition. We are very interactive on our Facebook page. We put stuff out. We answer questions. People can always call here. I think the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Red Wolf Recovery Program, also has information on their website.
Excellent. And if anybody out there does have evidence of red wolves remaining west of North Carolina, would you be interested in hearing or seeing about that evidence?
Yes. My email address is kwheeler@redwolves.com. I look at lots of pictures every week. Again, when I lay my head down at night, I just hope I've done something good for the wolf, and not something that makes me feel good, but that is a positive step forward for these amazing creatures.
Thank you so much for joining us here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, that about wraps it up, folks. I hope that you are as inspired as I am by the members of the group who are conducting citizen science. That's essentially what I've been doing for the last 15 years or so, pursuing this subject, and I've been inspired by other citizen scientists like Jane Goodall and like Diane Fossey. So if you're interested in this subject and pursuing it, get out there and do your best. Who knows, you might just discover an exoplanet or a wood ape.
And if you are interested in helping the NAWAC discover the wood ape, please visit our website at woodape.org. And I would also like to ask all of you to please rate and review our podcast wherever you receive your podcasts. It helps us out tremendously. Our next episode is entitled, Yea, Though I Walk Through the Valley of the Wood Ape. Myself, Brian Brown, and a couple of other citizen scientists in the NAWAC recently spent a very interesting week in Area X. This episode is all about that, so stay tuned.
microphone yetis were harmed during the recording of this podcast.